Boone Haskell's fist connected with Corinne Ashcroft's face before she even finished her sentence. The sound of it cut through every conversation in that saloon like a blade through canvas. A wet, heavy crack that turned 40 men into 40 statues. She hit the wall hard, one hand flying up too late to stop it, and slid down until she was half sitting on the sawdust floor with blood running freely from the split skin below her cheekbone. Her notebook had skidded 3 feet away. Boone stood over her, chest heaving, and he was smiling. That was the part nobody in the room could stop seeing. Not the blood, not the woman crumpled against the wall. The smile on Boone Haskell's face, like he had just done something he'd been looking forward to all week. "Please," Corinne whispered, and her eyes swept across 40 pairs of boots that all found reasons to look somewhere else. "Somebody help me." Not one man moved. If you've ever wondered what real courage looks like, not the loud kind, not the kind that comes easy, stay with this story to the end. Hit that like button so this channel knows you're here, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe if you haven't already, because the stories we tell here don't let go of you easily. Now let's go back 3 weeks to the morning a woman arrived in Black Ridge carrying nothing but a trunk, a head full of numbers, and more backbone than anyone in that town deserved. The westbound stage from Pueblo dropped Corinne Ashcroft at the edge of Black Ridge on a Tuesday morning in late October, and the first thing she noticed was that nobody was there to meet her. She stood on the hard-packed dirt beside her trunk and watched the stage roll away and tried to decide if that meant something or if Owen Mercer had simply gotten the date wrong. Owen wasn't the most precise man in his letters. She'd give him that much. His handwriting alone suggested someone who approached correspondence the way a man approached a fence he didn't want to climb, grudgingly, with the minimum possible effort. But he'd been clear about the date. She'd read the letter 4 times on the journey west, partly from nerves and partly because there wasn't much else to do. She picked up her traveling bag and left her trunk sitting by the stage post, figuring she'd send someone back for it once she found Owen, or at least found someone who knew him. Black Ridge was the kind of town that looked like it had once had ambitions and then quietly given them up. There was a main street of maybe 12 buildings, a water trough in the middle that needed cleaning, and a general smell of livestock and coal smoke that settled over everything like a second weather. 2 men sat outside the barbershop watching her with the alert, unhurried attention of people who didn't get many strangers and intended to make the most of this one. "Excuse me," Corinne said, stopping in front of them. "I'm looking for Owen Mercer. Do you know where I might find him?" The 2 men looked at each other. Something passed between them. Not quite a look of alarm, more like the specific discomfort of people who know something unpleasant and are calculating whether they have to be the ones to say it. "Owen Mercer," the older of the 2 repeated, as if making sure he'd heard the name correctly. "That's right. He runs a cattle operation north of town. We have an arrangement." She paused, then added, because she'd found that directness saved time, "A marriage arrangement. I've come from St. Louis." More of that look. The younger man suddenly found something very interesting to examine on the toe of his boot. "Ma'am," the older one finally said, "I'm real sorry to be the one telling you this. Owen Mercer passed about 10 days ago. Fever took him fast. We had the burial last Thursday." Corinne heard the words. She processed them the way she processed everything, methodically, one piece at a time, arranging them until they formed a picture she could work with. Owen was dead. He'd been dead for 10 days. She had been traveling for 11 days. He had almost certainly been already dying when she boarded the stage in St. Louis. "I see," she said. "Thank you for telling me." She stood there another moment, recalibrating. She had a return ticket she couldn't afford to use for another 3 weeks. She had $42 in a money belt under her dress. She had no family left in St. Louis worth going back to, and no job waiting for her there either, because she had resigned her position at Hartwell & Sons when the marriage arrangement was settled. What she did not have, she realized, was a plan. "Is there a boarding house?" she asked. "Mrs. Calloway runs a place on the East End," the younger man said, apparently feeling it was safe to contribute now that the worst had been delivered. "Clean rooms, reasonable rate." "Thank you," Corinne said again, and she picked up her bag and walked in the direction he pointed, and she did not cry. She'd had enough practice at not crying that it came naturally by now. She was 31 years old, She had been keeping books for businesses since she was 19, first for her father's dry goods store, then for Hartwell and Sons after her father died. And she had learned a long time ago that numbers didn't lie to you the way people did. Numbers told you exactly what was there and exactly what wasn't. And if you paid attention, they told you when something was wrong before the people involved even knew it themselves. She paid attention. It was the thing she was best at. Mrs. Calloway was a wide woman in her 50s with an expression that suggested she had stopped being surprised by the human capacity for poor decision-making sometime around 1867, and she gave Corinne a room without many questions, which Corinne appreciated. That night, lying in the dark listening to Black Ridge settle into itself, Corinne thought about Owen Mercer and felt something that wasn't quite grief. She hadn't known him well enough for grief, but was something adjacent to it. A missed opportunity. A path that had closed before she got to walk it. She thought about going to see his ranch the next morning, just to see it. She wasn't sure why, but something in her felt like she owed him at least that much. She went to sleep deciding she would. She was up before sunrise. The Mercer Ranch sat about 2 miles north of town on a patch of land that had clearly taken years of work to get functional. The main house was modest but solid. The barn was well maintained. The fence lines were straight and recently repaired. Owen Mercer, whatever his limitations as a letter writer, had been a careful man with his land, and standing outside his fence, Corinne felt that missed opportunity feeling again, sharper this time. She was standing there just looking when the rider came up behind her. "You must be the woman from St. Louis." She turned. The man on horseback was perhaps 45, dressed in clothes that cost considerably more than anyone in Black Ridge seemed to afford. He had a square jaw and pale eyes, and the kind of unhurried manner that Corinne had learned to recognize in certain clients back in St. Louis, the kind of men who had never once in their adult lives been told no in a way that stuck. "I am," she said, "Corinne Ashcroft, and you are?" "Dorian Pike." He said it the way you'd say the name of a town, like it was already on the map, already established, already something everyone knew. "I own most of the significant holdings in this valley. I also happen to be the primary creditor of what used to be Owen Mercer's operation." Corinne looked at him steadily. "Used to be." "I'm afraid so." He didn't look afraid of anything. "Owen had an outstanding loan with me for $1,100. He passed without making arrangements. The loan comes due, the property transfers. That's how it works." He offered her a thin, reasonable smile. "I'm sorry you made the journey for nothing, Miss Ashcroft. If you need assistance getting back to—" "I'd like to see the loan agreement," Corinne said. Pike blinked. It was small, barely a flicker, but she caught it. "I beg your pardon?" "The loan agreement between you and Owen Mercer. I'd like to review it." A pause. "That's really not necessary. The matter is settled." "I'm sure it is," Corinne said pleasantly. "I'd still like to see it." Pike looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was working hard to stay reasonable and finding it somewhat difficult. "I'll have my attorney send you a summary," he said finally. "A summary isn't the same as the original document." Another pause, longer this time. "Miss Ashcroft, I understand you've had a difficult few days. You've traveled a long way only to find a sad situation. But the legal reality here is, Mr. Pike," she said, "I spent 12 years keeping books for a commercial firm in St. Louis. I have reviewed more loan agreements than I can count. I know what they're supposed to contain and what they're supposed to say. I'm not asking for anything unreasonable. I'm asking to see the document that transferred this man's property." Pike's pleasant expression didn't disappear exactly, but something behind it changed, something that had been open-closed. "I'll be in touch," he said, and turned his horse and rode back toward town without another word. Corinne watched him go. She stood at Owen Mercer's fence a while longer, looking at Owen Mercer's barn and Owen Mercer's straight fence lines, and she turned over the conversation in her head the way she turned over a set of numbers that didn't quite add up. He hadn't said no. He'd said he'd be in touch, which was a different thing. A man with nothing to hide would have said no, it's not your business. The fact that he'd left the door cracked open, even a little, that told her something. She walked back to town. That afternoon, she asked Mrs. Calloway carefully and conversationally about Dorian Pike. "Oh, he owns half the valley," Mrs. Calloway said, refilling Corinne's coffee without being asked. Has for a few years now. Came in about 4 years ago with money and bought up the Hendricks place, then the old Garrison spread, then started doing loans for the smaller operations. She set the coffee pot down. Most folks are grateful for it, truth be told. Hard to get credit out here. Pike provides it. Has anyone had trouble with him? Mrs. Calloway was quiet for a moment. Had a few ranchers lose their places over loans, but loans go bad sometimes. That's just the way of it. She picked up the coffee pot again, though it didn't need moving. Pike's a powerful man in this town, Miss Ashcroft. He employs a lot of people and he keeps the peace. Sheriff Henderson's wife's brother works for Pike. Judge's clerk is Pike's cousin by marriage. She looked at Corinne directly. I'm telling you this for informational purposes. I understand, Corinne said. Good. Mrs. Calloway walked back toward the kitchen. More biscuits? Corinne stayed 2 more days just watching and asking quiet questions. She learned that Owen Mercer had been the 4th property owner in the valley to die in the past 2 years. She learned that 3 of those deaths had been ruled natural causes and 1 had been listed as accident. She learned that in each case, the property had transferred to Pike within 30 days. She learned that nobody talked about this directly, but that when you asked the right questions in the right way, people's eyes did things their mouths wouldn't. On the 3rd morning, she walked into Pike's hotel. It was the finest building in Black Ridge. 2 stories, freshly painted, with a carved wood front desk and actual glass in all the windows. Pike used the upper floor as his business office, and the lower floor as a hotel and dining room. The girl behind the front desk couldn't have been more than 17. I'm looking for work, Corinne said. Any kind. Cleaning, laundering, kitchen work. The girl looked uncertain. I'd have to ask Mr. Pike. Of course, Corinne said. I'll wait. She waited 40 minutes. When Pike finally came down, he looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Surprise, maybe, and something else underneath it. Miss Ashcroft, he said, this is unexpected. I need to stay in Black Ridge for a few more weeks, and I need to be practical about it, she said simply. I can keep books if that's useful, or I can do any kind of cleaning or administrative work. I'm not particular. You want to work in my hotel, he said it flatly, if you'll have me. He studied her face for a long moment. She kept her expression neutral and slightly tired, which was easy because she was genuinely tired and she let him look as long as he wanted. Cleaning, he said finally. 5 days a week. Starts early. That's fine, she said. He nodded once and went back upstairs. She started the next morning. The work was harder than anything she'd done at Hartwell and Sons, but it put her inside the building for 8 hours a day. And inside the building meant she could observe. She cleaned the dining room and the front hallway and 4 of the 6 guest rooms, which took her past the business office 3 times a morning. She noticed that Pike kept the office locked when he wasn't in it. She noticed that there was a second key on a peg inside the cleaning supply closet, presumably for the housekeeping use that had predated her arrival. She didn't touch it. Not yet. She watched the rhythm of the office. Who came and went. What times Pike was out of the building. When his enforcer, Boone Haskell, sat outside the office door and when he went to get his lunch. Boone Haskell was hard to miss. He was a large man, not just tall but wide, with a neck like a fence post and hands that looked like they'd been designed with a specific and unpleasant purpose in mind. He said almost nothing, ever, to anyone. He didn't need to. His presence was its own entire sentence. Corinne cleaned around him without looking at him directly, and he ignored her the way you ignore furniture. On her 6th day of work, she noticed that Pike had a meeting on Thursday mornings that took him out of the building for at least 2 hours. She noticed that on those same Thursday mornings, Boone Haskell walked his horse to the farrier, a habit, apparently, since the farrier later confirmed he came every week. That meant the office was unattended for somewhere between an hour and 90 minutes every Thursday morning. She thought about this for 4 days before she used the key. The office was orderly in a way that told her Pike was not naturally organized, but employed someone to keep things that way. There were filing drawers with labeled sections, and she moved through them quickly but carefully, touching as little as possible, reading without removing anything. She almost missed the second cabinet. It was pushed behind a standing wardrobe in the back corner, the kind of thing you wouldn't see if you didn't go all the way into the room. It was locked with a different lock than the office door, a heavier one, a padlock rather than a key lock. She didn't touch it. She filed its existence away in her head and left the office exactly as she'd found it, and relocked the door and put the key back on the peg and went back to cleaning the hallway. The next Thursday, she came with a hairpin she'd bent into a shape she'd learned from her father, who had picked locks as a hobby and taught her because she'd been a curious child who asked too many questions, and he had found it easier to answer them than to redirect them. The padlock took her 11 minutes. She had never been more aware of the sound of footsteps in a building in her life. Inside the locked cabinet were two things: a leather-bound ledger and a small tin box she didn't have time to open. She opened the ledger. The first thing she registered was the handwriting. Careful, precise, the kind of handwriting that came from someone who knew these records were important. The second thing she registered was that there were 14 entries, each with a name, a property description, a date, and a series of amounts. The third thing she registered, and the thing that made her grip the edge of the cabinet to steady herself, was that she recognized 5 of the names. 3 of them she'd heard mentioned as ranchers who'd lost their places to Pike over bad loans. 2 of them she'd been told were dead. She counted the dates, measured the intervals, ran the numbers in her head the way she'd been running numbers since she was 8 years old. The intervals between acquisition date and death date were nearly identical across all 14 cases. She cross-referenced them against the transfer dates. The properties moved within an average of 19 days of each owner's death. 14 times. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't the natural risk of frontier lending. It was a system, and somebody had kept meticulous records of it, and those records were sitting in a locked cabinet in a locked office in a town where the sheriff's brother-in-law worked for the man who'd built the system. Her hands were steady. They were always steady when she was working with numbers. The fear came later, in private. Right now, she had a job to do. She did not take the ledger. Taking it would tell Pike he'd been found before she had anywhere to take the information. Instead, she took her own small notebook from her apron pocket and she began to copy. She worked for 27 minutes and copied everything. Every name, every date, every amount, every property description. She used her own shorthand notation that she'd developed over years of keeping records. A system of symbols and abbreviations that was legible to her and no one else. She relocked the padlock. It took 4 minutes this time. She was getting faster. And she left the office, and she locked the main door and replaced the key and went back to cleaning the east hallway with her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her ears. Nobody stopped her. Nobody looked at her twice. She was invisible. She had been invisible her entire working life, and for the first time that was an asset rather than an insult. She carried the notebook back to Mrs. Calloway's that evening, pressed against her ribs under her dress. That night, she sat at the small desk in her room and decoded her notes and wrote out the full picture in clear language. Then she looked at what she'd written for a long time, thinking about what it meant and what she could do with it and who in this town she could actually trust. The answer to that last question was a short list. Mrs. Calloway might help her, would probably help her, if approached right. But Mrs. Calloway was also a woman in a town where men made the decisions that mattered, and even a sympathetic landlady couldn't get this evidence in front of a judge. The sheriff was compromised. The clerk was Pike's cousin by marriage. The circuit judge. She'd heard he came through Black Ridge roughly once a month. She didn't know his name or his character, but a circuit judge operated outside the local network. A circuit judge answered to state authority, not to whatever arrangements Pike had made with the people around him. She needed to get to the circuit judge. She needed to know when he was coming. She spent the next 3 days gathering that information carefully, asking oblique questions at the general store and the post office, and once, carefully, at the barbershop, framing everything as the natural curiosity of a newcomer trying to understand how the town worked. The judge was expected in 2 weeks, she determined. 2 weeks to keep her head down, keep cleaning Pike's hallways, keep her notebook hidden, and stay out of trouble. She almost made it. The 11th day, she was carrying linens down the upstairs corridor when she heard voices from behind the business office door. She was not making a special effort to listen. It was simply that the door was not fully latched, and Pike was not using his indoor voice. "She's been asking around about the Mercer property," said a voice she didn't recognize. "Tom at the post office mentioned it. Said she was asking about legal transfers." A pause. "How much does she know?" That was Pike. "Can't say for certain. But she's been here 11 days and she's still asking questions. Another pause. Longer. Make sure Boone stays close to her, Pike said. I want to know if she goes anywhere near Henderson's office, or anywhere near the courthouse. Corinne kept walking, steady pace, linens against her chest, down the corridor and around the corner and down the back stairs and out through the kitchen door into the cool air of late afternoon, and she stood there behind the hotel for a moment and breathed. They knew she was asking questions. They didn't know what she'd found. If they knew what she'd found, this conversation would have sounded very different. But they were watching her now. Boone would be watching her. She had maybe a few days before they decided questions were enough reason to act. She needed to move faster. That evening, she went looking for someone she'd been peripherally aware of for the past week. A lean, quiet man she'd seen around town 3 or 4 times, always on the edge of things, never quite part of whatever was happening. He'd been at the general store the day she asked about the circuit judge. He'd been sitting outside the livery when she walked past it 2 days later. She didn't know his name. Nobody she'd asked had offered one, which itself was interesting. In a town this size, everybody had a name people used. She found him at the far end of the bar in the saloon, a glass of water in front of him, not the whiskey, just water, watching the room with the specific quality of attention that she recognized because she used it herself. The attention of someone building a picture from small details, assembling information without appearing to gather it. She sat down one stool away. "You've been in this town about as long as I have," she said, without looking at him. A beat of silence. "A bit longer," he said. "What's your name?" Another pause. "Silas?" "Just Silas?" "For now." She glanced at him then, just briefly. He was younger than she'd first thought, maybe 34, 35, with the kind of face that looked like it had been through more weather than his years accounted for. There was nothing particularly threatening about him, which she suspected was very deliberate. "People seem nervous around you," she said. "People get nervous about a lot of things that aren't actually dangerous," he said. "There's a warrant," she said. It wasn't a question. His jaw tightened just slightly. "Old one. Comes up sometimes." "What's it for?" He looked at her then, straight on, and she met it. "Rustling," he said. "Supposed rustling. I was in the wrong place when somebody decided they needed someone to blame." She held his gaze long enough to decide she believed him, not because she was naive, but because she was good at reading the difference between a man lying about his past and a man tired of a lie that had been told about him. Those were two distinct things, and they looked different if you paid attention. "I have information about something happening in this town," she said carefully. "Something significant. I'm trying to figure out how to get it to the right person before the wrong people figure out what I know." Silas was quiet for a moment. "What kind of information?" "The kind that gets people hurt if the wrong person finds out about it first." Another silence. He looked at his water glass. "The circuit judge comes in about 3 days," he said finally. "If you're going to the judge, you want to do it the minute he arrives, before Pike hears he's in town. Pike has people watching the main road. Judge usually comes in from the northeast." She turned to look at him fully. "How do you know that?" "Been watching this town for a while," he said. "Why?" He picked up his water glass and looked at it. "Owen Mercer was my cousin," he said. "Second cousin. We weren't close. But he wrote me a letter about 6 months ago saying he thought he was in trouble with Pike's loan. Then he stopped writing." He set the glass down. "I came to find out why." The saloon noise filled the space between them for a moment. "I'm sorry," Corinne said. "Were you close with him?" Silas asked. "Owen?" "No. We'd only exchanged letters. I was coming here to marry him." She said it plainly, without apology or grief performance. "I didn't know him well, but I'm coming to know the man who may have killed him, and I intend to do something about it." Silas looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face shifted, not softened exactly, but recalibrated. 3 days, he said. "Judge arrives from the northeast road, first light usually. Pike's man on that road is Carl Dupree. He takes his breakfast at the diner at 6:30, doesn't miss it. So between 6:30 and 7:15 that road is clear. Generally. Corinne nodded slowly. Thank you, Silas. Don't thank me yet, he said. He didn't explain what he meant, and she didn't ask. She went back to Mrs. Calloway's with the notebook still pressed against her ribs, and she sat at her desk and she went through everything she'd copied one more time, checking her work the way she always checked her work, looking for anything she'd missed or gotten wrong. She hadn't missed anything. She rarely did. But as she was reading back through the entries, something caught her eye that she'd noted but hadn't fully processed. The third entry from the bottom had a name she recognized from a different context. Not from the gossip she'd gathered in Black Ridge, but from a conversation she'd overheard on her first full day in town. Two men outside the general store, talking about somebody's widow who'd taken her kids to live with her sister in Amarillo after her husband died of bad water. Their words, 2 years ago. The husband's name had been Lester Crane. Lester Crane was in the ledger. Property transferred to Pike 18 days after death, listed cause illness. Corinne sat very still for a moment, looking at that name. Then she carefully added a note to her copy of that entry. Widow relocated Amarillo. Witness potentially available. She worked until midnight, building the clearest possible picture of what she had and what it meant and how to present it. Then she put the notebook back under her mattress, in a small slit she'd cut in the ticking, and she lay down in the dark and she did not sleep for a very long time. 3 days felt like both too long and not long enough. She was still awake when she heard the footsteps in the hallway outside her room, heavy ones, deliberate, pausing outside her door. She lay completely still, watching the thin line of light at the bottom of the door. The footsteps stood there for a count of perhaps 30 seconds. Then they moved away. Corinne stayed still for another full minute after she couldn't hear them anymore, and then she sat up in the dark and looked at the door and understood that her 3 days had just become significantly less. She needed to move, not toward the judge, that was still 3 days out, but toward some kind of protection, some kind of witness, someone who could see her and know what she carried, so that if something happened to her, the information didn't disappear with her. She thought about Silas at the bar with his glass of water. She thought about the way he'd said, "I came to find out why." Not "I came to do something about it," which would have been bravado. Just find out why. The phrasing of a careful man. At 6 in the morning, when the sky was still more dark than light, she got up and dressed and tucked the notebook inside her dress and went downstairs and outside. And she walked to the livery where Silas kept his horse, because she had noticed that 3 times when she'd walked past it in the evenings, there had been a light on in the small side room that the liveryman let out to travelers. She knocked. There was a pause, and then the door opened, and Silas stood there with a jacket half on and his hand near the gun at his hip, and when he saw it was her, the hand moved away from the gun. "Someone stood outside my door last night," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he stepped back and let her in. It was a small room with a cot and a table and the smell of hay coming through the walls. He finished buttoning his jacket while she talked, and he didn't interrupt, which she appreciated. "I need someone to know what I have," she said. "Not to hold it. I need the original to go to the judge. But I need someone to know, so that if something happens to me, it doesn't end here." "Tell me," he said. She told him. Not everything. There wasn't time for everything. But the essential shape of it, 14 entries, matching intervals, the pattern of deaths and transfers, the widow in Amarillo, the original ledger still in Pike's locked cabinet. Silas listened with his arms crossed and his face doing that thing it had done in the saloon, building a picture from small details, assembling without appearing to assemble. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, "He's going to figure out you've seen the ledger. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but he'll figure it out. I know. When he does, he's not going to be subtle about it. I know that too." He looked at her. "Are you scared?" "Yes," she said simply. "Are you?" A long pause. "I've been scared since I rode into this town and figured out what happened to Owen," he said. "Doesn't stop me from doing things." "Same," she said. She left before the liveryman arrived and walked back to Mrs. Calloway's and ate breakfast and went to work at the hotel, cleaning hallways, invisible and watchful, With the notebook under her dress and the circuit judge 3 days away, and the sound of those footsteps from the night before still sitting in the back of her mind like a question she hadn't answered yet, she had 2 days and 21 hours to go. And somewhere in the building above her, Dorian Pike was already deciding she'd run out of time. She made it 2 more days before everything started unraveling at once. The morning of the second day, she arrived at the hotel to find that her cleaning assignment had been changed. Instead of the east hallway and the guest rooms, the route that took her past the business office 3 times, she was assigned to the kitchen and the laundry outbuilding at the back of the property. The girl at the front desk delivered this information without making eye contact, which told Corinne everything she needed to know about who had issued the instruction and why. She said nothing. She went to the kitchen and she scrubbed pots and she thought. They hadn't fired her. That was the interesting part. Firing her would have meant she had nowhere to be, which meant she'd have nothing to do but pursue whatever she was pursuing. Keeping her employed but redirected meant they could watch her movements and keep her occupied and maintain the appearance that everything was normal. Pike was smart. She'd known that from the first conversation. He didn't make obvious moves when subtle ones would serve. She scrubbed the pots and she thought about the notebook under her dress, and she thought about the judge arriving tomorrow morning from the Northeast Road. And she thought about Carl Dupree eating his breakfast at 6:30 at the diner and the window that would open while he was in there with his eggs. One more day. She could manage one more day. Boone Haskell appeared in the kitchen doorway at 10 in the morning. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, filling the frame with his considerable width, watching her work. She didn't look up. She finished washing the skillet she was working on and set it on the drying rack and moved to the next one, and Boone stood there watching her the way a cat watches a mouse hole, patient and entirely without warmth. After about 4 minutes, he left. She exhaled slowly and kept washing. He came back twice more that day. Same thing, standing, watching, leaving without a word. It was a technique, she understood. Not a threat, not yet. Just the persistent reminder that she was being watched, that her movements were being tracked, that the illusion of freedom she'd had for the past 2 weeks was exactly that, an illusion. It was the kind of thing designed to make a person nervous enough to do something stupid. She was not going to do something stupid. At noon, she ate the meal the kitchen girls set out for staff, beans and cornbread, better than she'd expected. And she listened to the 2 kitchen workers talk about their weekend and the upcoming harvest festival and whether the dry goods store was going to get the blue calico in before winter. And she contributed nothing and absorbed everything, the way she always did, building her picture of the room she was in. That afternoon, around 3 o'clock, she heard something that changed her picture considerably. She was in the laundry outbuilding, working the mangle press on a pile of table linens, when she heard 2 men talking on the other side of the thin wall, in the narrow alley between the laundry and the woodshed. She couldn't see them, but the wall was board and batten construction with gaps she could have put 2 fingers through, and their voices came through clearly enough. "Pike wants it done before the judge gets here," said the first voice, a voice she didn't recognize. "That's tomorrow morning." That was Boone. She knew his voice by now, even though she'd rarely heard it, low, flat, with no particular feeling in it. "Doesn't give much time. He's not asking your opinion on the schedule." A pause. "The woman or the other one?" "Woman first. Other one after, if he hasn't already moved on." Another pause. Longer. "The woman's been staying at Calloway's. 3rd room, east side." "I know where she's been staying." The first voice said something she didn't catch, and then their footsteps moved away from the wall and down the alley, and Corinne stood at the mangle press with her hand still on the handle and the blood running cold through her chest in a very specific and clarifying way. Tonight. They were planning it for tonight. She pressed the linen she was working on because her hands needed something to do, and because she needed to think clearly, and panic was not clarity. Panic was the enemy of every clear thought she'd ever had. She pressed the linen and she breathed steadily, and she ran through her options the way she'd run through a column of figures, quickly, checking each one against what she knew. She could go to the sheriff. She'd been over this before. Henderson was compromised, his brother-in-law was on Pike's payroll, and showing up at the sheriff's office with a story about an overheard conversation in an alley was not going to produce the outcome she needed before tonight. She could leave Black Ridge entirely. Get out now, take the notebook, Find a town with a telegraph and wire the state marshal. But she didn't know for certain that the state marshal's office was beyond Pike's reach, and leaving meant abandoning the original ledger in that cabinet. And without the original, her copied notes were evidence of what she'd seen, but not proof of what existed. She could go to Silas. She thought about his face when he'd said, "I came to find out why." She thought about the hand that had moved away from the gun when he'd seen it was her at the door. She finished the linens and hung them to dry and told the kitchen girl she was feeling unwell and needed to go back to her room, which was true in a strictly technical sense, and she walked back to Mrs. Calloway's with a normal pace and a roaring in her ears that she kept firmly behind her face. Mrs. Calloway was in the front parlor mending a shirt when Corinne came in. "You're back early," she said, without looking up. "Feeling a bit off," Corinne said. Mrs. Calloway looked up then, with the sharpness of a woman who had spent 40 years reading people's faces accurately. "Sit down," she said. It wasn't a question. Corinne sat. Mrs. Calloway set the mending aside and looked at her steadily. "Something's happened." "I need to tell you something," Corinne said, "and I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is serious and that it may put you in a difficult position, and if you want me to stop, I'll stop." The older woman looked at her for a moment. "Go ahead," Corinne told her. "Not everything, not the details of the ledger, not all 14 names, but enough. The cabinet, the copied entries, the pattern of deaths, the overheard conversation in the alley." She watched Mrs. Calloway's face while she talked and saw it go through several stages: skepticism, reluctant credibility, and then a particular kind of grim recognition that told Corinne the woman had already suspected something like this, had filed it away in the part of her mind where uncomfortable knowledge went to sit quietly. "Lena Garrett's husband," Mrs. Calloway said when Corinne finished. 3 years ago. They said it was his heart. Is he in your memory as someone who had dealings with Pike?" "He had a loan with Pike," Mrs. Calloway said slowly. "A small one. For repairs after the barn fire." She stopped. "He died 4 months after he took it out." Corinne nodded. She didn't have Garrett on her list, which meant either the ledger wasn't complete or she'd missed an entry in her 27 minutes. She filed that away. "Tonight," Mrs. Calloway said flatly. "That's what I heard." The older woman sat very still for a moment. Then she stood up. "You're not sleeping in that room tonight," she said. "There's a storage room in the cellar. It locks from the inside. You'll sleep there." "I need to get to the livery first," Corinne said. "The man with the warrant." "Yes. I'll send my boy Tommy to the livery with a message," Mrs. Calloway said. "You're not walking across town by yourself this afternoon." Corinne started to object, and Mrs. Calloway looked at her with an expression that ended the objection before it formed. "Write what you need to say," the older woman said. "Tommy's 14, and he looks exactly like what he is, which is a boy running an errand. Nobody's watching him." Corinne borrowed paper and pencil from the writing desk in the parlor and wrote, "Tonight, change in plans. Come when you can before dark. CA." She folded it and wrote Silas on the outside. Mrs. Calloway called for Tommy, who appeared from the back of the house with hay in his hair and a look of supreme indifference to whatever the adults needed, which Corinne found unexpectedly reassuring. Tommy took the note and disappeared, and Mrs. Calloway made tea that neither of them touched, and they waited. Silas arrived 40 minutes later. He came around the back of the house, through the kitchen door, and Mrs. Calloway let him in without comment and went to sit in the front parlor to watch the street, leaving them at the kitchen table. He read the situation in her face before she said anything. "How bad?" "I overheard Boone talking to someone in the alley behind the laundry," she said. "Tonight, my room." Silas was quiet for a moment. His jaw worked once, the way a man's jaw does when he's running through something he doesn't like the look of. "The judge comes tomorrow." "Yes." "Where's the notebook?" She put her hand to her sternum, just briefly. He nodded. "Okay." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table. "The Northeast Road. There's a place about 2 miles out where the road bends around a stand of cottonwoods. Judge always slows down there because the road gets soft. If you can get out of town before first light, you can meet him before he even gets to Black Ridge. If Pike's man is watching the roads, not that road, not before 4 in the morning. He said it with the certainty of someone who had been watching road traffic in this valley for a while. Carl Dupree doesn't start his watch until 5:30. He takes the same route every morning. The 2 miles from the northeast are clear before that. Can you get me out of town without anyone seeing? He looked at her steadily. That depends on what happens tonight. I'm not staying in my room, she said. Mrs. Calloway has a storage room in the cellar. Good. He thought for a moment. I'll be outside this house from midnight on. You need to be ready to move by 3:30. All right. He started to stand, then stopped. You understand that if this doesn't work... I understand that if this doesn't work, the original ledger stays in that cabinet and Pike destroys it within an hour of the judge leaving town, she said. And then 14 families never get justice, and the people who are supposed to protect them never answer for it. She looked at him steadily. So it has to work. He held her gaze for a moment. It has to work, he agreed, as if that settled it, which perhaps it did. After he left, Corinne went upstairs and changed into her plainest dress, dark gray, nothing that would catch light or sound, and transferred the notebook to the inside of her traveling coat, which she wore even though the kitchen was warm. She went through the notebook one more time by memory, checking that her shorthand was clear, that anyone who needed to decode it could do so with her assistance, that nothing was ambiguous. Then she went back downstairs and helped Mrs. Calloway make supper and wash dishes and carried her small bag down to the cellar storage room, where a cot had appeared that hadn't been there this morning and a lamp burned low near the door. Lock it from inside, Mrs. Calloway said. The latch is heavy. Don't open it for anything until morning unless you hear me call your name first. I know you're taking a risk, Corinne said. Mrs. Calloway made a sound that might have been a laugh and might have been something older and more complicated than a laugh. Lena Garrett's husband is buried in the East Plot, she said. He was a good man, kept bees, used to bring me honey at Christmas. She paused. Lock the door. Corinne locked the door. She sat on the cot in the dim light and she waited, and she did not sleep. She heard the house settle and the wind pick up outside, and once, around 10 o'clock, she heard footsteps on the porch above her. Heavy footsteps, not Mrs. Calloway's, not Tommy's, that moved around the perimeter of the house in a slow, deliberate circle. She sat very still and counted her heartbeats. The footsteps paused outside what would have been the east side of the house, where her room was, and then moved on. At some point between 1 and 2 in the morning, she heard something that might have been voices outside, and then a sound like a brief scuffle, and then nothing. At 3, she heard Mrs. Calloway's voice, low but clear, directly above the cellar door. Miss Ashcroft. She unlocked the door and climbed the stairs. Mrs. Calloway stood in the kitchen with a shawl over her nightgown, and her expression arranged into something that was doing its best to look calm. Silas was at the back door. There was a scrape across his left cheekbone that hadn't been there this afternoon, and his knuckles on his right hand were split. Carl Dupree's cousin, he said when he saw her looking. He wasn't on the usual schedule tonight. Is he? He's fine. He's going to have a headache and a story about falling off a fence, but he's fine. Corinne looked at him for another moment, then she nodded. Let's go. Mrs. Calloway pressed something into Corinne's hand. She looked down. It was $6 in folded bills. For the journey back if you need it, the older woman said. You can return it or not. I don't care about the money. Corinne opened her mouth, and Mrs. Calloway made that same sound again, the one that wasn't quite a laugh, and turned back toward her bedroom. Outside, the air was cold and the sky was doing that thing it did before dawn, where the stars were still out, but the horizon had started to lighten by fractions so small you couldn't see them changing. Silas had 2 horses. She didn't ask where the second one had come from. They rode without talking. The northeast road was 2 miles of quiet darkness under a sky that was beginning, very slowly, to turn. Silas kept his horse slightly ahead of hers, not because he was in charge, but because he was reading the road, and she understood that. She kept her hand on the notebook through the fabric of her coat. At the Cottonwood Bend, he stopped. This is the slow point, he said quietly. He'll ease up here. How long? If he left at first light from Millhaven, he's about 40 minutes out. They waited. The horizon shifted from black to deep gray to something approaching the color of old pewter, and somewhere up in the cottonwoods a bird started making noise about it. Corinne's legs were stiff from the ride, and she climbed down and walked a short distance on the road and back. "Were you really going to just watch?" she asked. Not accusing, genuinely curious. "Before I came to your room that morning, were you going to gather information about Owen and then what?" Silas was quiet for a moment. "I didn't have a what?" he said honestly. "I had a warrant following me. I can't exactly walk into a courthouse." "So you were just going to know?" "I was going to know, and I was going to figure out the rest." He paused. "I hadn't gotten to the rest yet." She thought about that. "That must be a particular kind of awful," she said, "knowing something is wrong and not having a way to act on it." "Yeah," he said. "Just that." She walked the short distance on the road again. The bird in the cottonwoods got louder. The sky lightened another fraction. "If this works," she said, "if the judge takes this seriously and moves on it, Pike's going to know it was me." "Pike's going to be in custody," Silas said. "If it works, and between now and then there are a lot of steps." "Yes." "I'm not looking for reassurance," she clarified. "I just want to say it clearly so I'm not pretending it's simple." "It's not simple," he agreed. She nodded. "Good." They understood each other. 20 minutes later she heard it. The slow creak of a wagon coming around the far bend of the northeast road, a single horse pulling a rig with one occupant and a traveling bag strapped to the back. She walked to the middle of the road and stood there. The wagon slowed and stopped about 15 yards away. The driver, a man of perhaps 60 with a gray beard and a traveling coat, looked at her with the careful assessment of a man who has spent years deciding quickly whether strangers in roads were going to be problems. "I need to speak with Circuit Judge Edmund Holloway," she said. The man looked at her for a moment. "That would be me," he said. "Who are you?" "My name is Corinne Ashcroft. I have documented evidence of 14 fraudulent property seizures in Black Ridge carried out by a man named Dorian Pike, and I need to get it in front of you before he knows you've arrived in town." Another pause. Holloway looked past her at Silas, who was still on his horse a few yards back. "Who's that?" "Someone who helped me get here safely," she said. "He's not involved in the evidence." "What kind of documentation are we talking about?" She pulled out the notebook. He looked at it from the wagon. "That's your notebook." "It's my copy of his ledger," she said. "The original is still in his office. I copied every entry. Names, dates, amounts, property descriptions. 14 cases. I can explain the pattern, the intervals, the connections between each transfer and each death. I can tell you where the original ledger is located in his building and exactly what it looks like." She held his gaze. "I know this isn't how this is supposed to work, but this is how it has to work this morning, because once he knows you're in town, that ledger disappears." Holloway looked at her for a long time. She let him look. "Get in," he said finally. "Explain it on the road." She climbed up beside him. As the wagon started moving, she looked back at Silas, still on his horse at the bend in the road. He gave a small nod. She turned back toward Black Ridge and opened the notebook and began. She told it the same way she'd told everything in her life, in order, logically, each piece following from the previous one. She didn't editorialize. She didn't speculate beyond what the numbers showed. She laid out what she'd found and what it meant, and let him draw the conclusions that the evidence led to. Because she'd learned long ago that a man who reaches a conclusion himself is far more committed to it than a man who is told what to think. Holloway asked sharp, precise questions. The questions of someone who understood evidence and documentation and knew the difference between correlation and proof. She answered each one directly. By the time they could see the first buildings of Black Ridge, she had walked him through 11 of the 14 entries, and he had asked for the notebook to read the remaining 3 himself, which she handed over without hesitation. "The original ledger," he said, reading. "Locked cabinet behind the standing wardrobe in his office. Padlock, not a keyed lock." "Yes?" "And you believe the original matches your copies." "I know it does," she said. "I'm good with numbers, Judge Holloway. I don't make transcription errors." He looked at her sidelong. "You're very certain of yourself." "In this specific area, yes," she said. "In other areas, I'm working with what I have like everyone else." Something shifted in his expression. Not softened exactly, but adjusted, the way a person adjusts when they revise an estimate upward. "I'm going to need to move quickly," he said, "before anyone in town has a chance to—" "I know," she said. "Go straight to the courthouse. Don't stop at the hotel." "Pike usually makes a courtesy call when I arrive," Holloway said. "He'll know within the hour that I'm here." "Then we have an hour," she said. He looked at her one more time, then shook the reins and picked up the pace. What happened in the next 40 minutes was not simple, and it was not clean, and it was not the way justice was supposed to work in an ideal world where institutions were reliable and corrupt men announced themselves clearly in advance. It was messy, and it was quick, and it required Holloway to make 3 decisions in rapid succession that he was not supposed to make without more deliberation, and he made them anyway because the evidence was what it was. And he was the kind of man who, when confronted with something clear, acted on it. He went to the courthouse. He read all 14 entries in full. He sent his clerk, his own clerk, not the local one, to the land records office for the official transfer documents. When those came back and matched Corinne's entries date for date and amount for amount, he called for Sheriff Henderson. Henderson arrived looking like a man who had expected a routine courtesy call and found himself standing in front of something he couldn't manage or maneuver around. He looked at the notebook, then at Corinne, then at Holloway, and then back at the notebook. And something crossed his face that was part calculation and part the specific look of a man who has spent years looking the other way and has just realized the direction he was looking is no longer safe. "I'll need deputies," Holloway said. "You're 2, and I want the man who came in with Miss Ashcroft as a 3rd. He knows the layout of the building." Henderson's jaw tightened. "That man has a warrant." "I'm aware of the warrant," Holloway said. "I'm also aware of who issued it. We'll address that separately. Right now I need 4 people who aren't on Dorian Pike's payroll to accompany me to his hotel." Henderson was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'll get my deputies." Corinne sat in the courthouse and waited. She was good at waiting. It was maybe the skill she'd developed most thoroughly over the past 31 years. The ability to be still and quiet while things that mattered moved forward without her direct participation, trusting that she'd done her part correctly. She thought about Owen Mercer and his straight fence lines and his carefully maintained barn, and she thought about Lena Garrett's husband who kept bees and brought honey at Christmas, and she thought about the other 12 names in the ledger, the families behind those names. The children who'd grown up with less because a man with pale eyes and an unhurried manner had decided their father's land was worth more than their father's lives. She sat with that for a while. She didn't push it away. It deserved to be sat with. 25 minutes after Henderson left, she heard noise from the direction of Pike's hotel. Not shouting, nothing dramatic, just the particular quality of purposeful commotion that things made when they were being searched or secured or dismantled. She looked out the courthouse window and saw 2 of Henderson's deputies walking across the main street with a man between them. Not Pike. Too big. Boone Haskell, with his hands bound in front of him, walking with the specific stiff dignity of a man who is pretending this doesn't matter and will pretend all the way to the jail cell. She watched him cross the street. Then she turned back to the window and waited, and eventually the noise from the hotel changed character, and she understood that something important had just been found, or not found, or confirmed, and she'd know which one when Holloway came back. He came back 40 minutes later, and he was carrying the original ledger. He set it on the table next to her notebook, and he opened both to the first page, and he looked back and forth between them for a long moment without speaking. Then, "Miss Ashcroft." "Yes." "Every entry." "Yes." He looked at her with an expression that had something complicated in it, respect maybe, and something adjacent to discomfort. The discomfort of a man who has spent years in a system that works a certain way, being confronted with a situation that worked differently than it should have, and being forced to acknowledge that the situation had required a woman with a hairpin in 27 minutes and a very good memory to do what the system hadn't. "I'll need your full statement," he said. "Of course," she said. "How long do I have?" He looked at her. "Before what?" "Before Pike is formally arrested and knows it was me." Holloway was quiet for a moment. "Henderson is bringing him in now." She nodded. Then I'd like to give you the full statement quickly, if that's all right. I want to be finished before he's in that building. Why? She thought about it for a second. Because I've spent the past 2 weeks being careful and invisible, and I'd like to still be breathing when this is resolved, she said. And I'm not sure I trust the walls of this courthouse to be a sufficient barrier between me and Pike's response when he hears my name. Holloway looked at her steadily. You're safer than you think. Maybe, she said, but I've been operating on the assumption that I'm less safe than I think, and that's worked out better for me so far. He almost smiled. It was a brief thing and quickly gone. Give me the statement, he said, and sat down across from her with his pen. She talked for 40 minutes. She was thorough and she was orderly, and she started from the beginning. The stage dropping her off, the two men outside the barber shop, Owen Mercer's fence lines, Pike on horseback saying that's how it works. And she worked forward from there, leaving out nothing relevant and wasting no time on anything that wasn't. When she finished, Holloway set down his pen and looked at what he'd written, and then he looked at her, and the expression on his face was one she'd seen before, on the faces of certain men at Hartwell and Sons, when they'd sent her to review the books of a struggling client, and she'd come back with a complete picture they hadn't expected and hadn't entirely known how to respond to. It was the expression of a man recalibrating his assessment of what he was dealing with. I'm going to need you to stay in town, he said. I know. And I'm going to need you to be careful for the next few days. Until this is formally... I know that too, she said. He nodded once. He stood up. He picked up the original ledger and held it for a moment, weight and significance both, and then he set it down and went back to the work of dismantling what Dorian Pike had built, one legal document at a time. Corinne sat alone in the courthouse room for a minute, looking at her notebook on the table beside the original ledger. The two of them side by side, every entry matching, every date, every name, every amount. She picked up her notebook and put it back inside her coat. Outside, through the courthouse window, she could see the main street of Black Ridge in the thin morning light, going about the early business of a frontier town. A man sweeping his porch, a dog cutting across the road at an angle, the door of the diner propped open to let out the breakfast smoke. Normal things, ordinary things, the texture of a morning that didn't know yet that something underneath the town had just shifted. She thought about Silas at the Cottonwood Bend, watching her climb into the judge's wagon. She thought about what he'd said. I didn't have a what. She thought she understood that better now than she had this morning. You could know something was wrong and spend a long time not having a what, sitting with the knowledge and the warrant and the grave of a second cousin you hadn't known very well, and sometimes knowing wasn't enough, and sometimes having a what wasn't enough either. And sometimes what it took was one person willing to spend 27 minutes in a locked room with a hairpin and a notebook and copy every damning entry by hand before anyone realized she'd been there. She sat with that thought. Then she stood up, straightened her coat, and walked out into the morning to find out what came next. What Corinne had not anticipated, and should have, was that arresting Dorian Pike in the morning did not make Black Ridge safe by afternoon. She understood this the moment she stepped out of the courthouse and saw the way the street had changed. It was the same street it had been an hour ago. Same buildings, same dirt, same dog cutting across at the same angle. But the people on it were different. Not different people, the same people, but they were standing differently. Tighter, closer to their own doorways. A cluster of 3 men outside the feed store who stopped talking the instant they saw her come out of the courthouse and didn't start again while she could see them. Word had gotten out. In a town this size, word always got out. And the question was never whether it would spread, but what shape it took as it moved from person to person. What got added and what got left out, and whose version became the one people believed. She walked back toward Mrs. Calloway's with her spine straight and her pace deliberate, and she felt those 3 men watching her the whole way. Pike had been in this town for 4 years. He employed people, loaned money, kept what passed for peace. The sheriff's brother-in-law worked for him. The clerk was his cousin by marriage. And now he was sitting in a jail cell because a woman who'd arrived 3 weeks ago with a trunk and $42 had spent 11 days cleaning his hotel and one critical Thursday with a hairpin and a notebook. Some people were going to be grateful. Some people were going to be angry. And some people, the ones who'd borrowed money from Pike and still owed it, the ones whose livelihoods were tangled up in his operations, were going to be scared in a way that made them unpredictable. Corinne walked and thought about all of this, and arrived at Mrs. Calloway's to find Silas already there, at the kitchen table, with a cup of coffee he'd apparently made himself. "You could have knocked," she said. "Mrs. Calloway told me where the coffee was," he said. Mrs. Calloway appeared from the pantry. "He knocked," she said. "Sit down. I'll make eggs." Corinne sat. She felt the exhaustion of the past several hours beginning to find its way through the sustained tension that had been holding it back. A heavy, specific tiredness that settled behind her eyes and in her shoulders, and in the particular muscles you used to keep your face neutral when you were frightened. "Holloway has the original ledger," she said. Silas nodded. He already knew that part, apparently. Word really did travel fast. "Pike?" she asked. "In a cell. Boone, too. Two of Pike's other men ran when they heard the deputies coming, but Henderson's got men on the roads." He paused. "Henderson's brother-in-law quit this morning, came in and handed over his badge to Henderson's face and walked out." She absorbed that. "How did Henderson take it?" "Hard to tell with Henderson. His face doesn't do much." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "He's doing the right thing, though. For now." "For now," she agreed. Mrs. Calloway set a plate of eggs in front of each of them and sat down across the table with her own cup. The three of them ate in a kind of quiet that had several layers to it. Relief, wariness, the awareness that the morning had gone better than it might have, and that the afternoon was still unsettled. "People are nervous," Corinne said. "People are scared," Mrs. Calloway corrected. "Some of them had loans with Pike. Small ones, for seed or repairs or a hard winter. They don't know what happens to those loans now that he's arrested. They don't know if someone's going to come collect." She set her cup down. "Fear makes people do strange things." "I know," Corinne said. Outside, a horse went past fast. Not a panicked run, but a deliberate, purposeful canter, the kind that meant someone was going somewhere with intent. Silas looked at the window without turning his head, a peripheral check, and then looked back at his eggs. "His attorney's still free," he said. "Man named Galt. He's been with Pike since before Black Ridge." "Where is he now?" "Rode out this morning toward the telegraph office in Millhaven. He ate a forkful of eggs. Which means he's either sending for help or sending messages to people Pike didn't want connected to him in public." Corinne thought about that. "Holloway needs to know." "I told Henderson's deputy an hour ago. Whether Henderson tells Holloway is Henderson's choice." He looked at her. "There's a lot that's Henderson's choice today." That was accurate and uncomfortable. Sheriff Henderson was a man who had spent years making accommodations. Small ones at first, probably, the kind that seemed reasonable in the moment, and then larger ones as the weight of the smaller ones made it harder to say no. He had arrived at this morning carrying 4 years of those accommodations, and what he did with them today would determine a great deal about what happened next. She didn't entirely trust him, but she didn't have a choice about what she trusted right now. The judge was here and the evidence was secured and Pike was in a cell, and the rest of it was, for the next few hours at least, outside her direct control. She was not comfortable with things being outside her direct control. She had never been comfortable with that, and she was 31 years old, and she had learned a long time ago that being uncomfortable with something did not change its nature. After breakfast, she went upstairs and lay down on her actual bed for the first time in over a day, still dressed, still wearing the coat with the notebook in it, and she slept for 3 hours without dreaming. She woke to voices downstairs, Mrs. Calloway's and someone else's, a woman's voice she didn't recognize, with an edge of distress in it that cut through the floor and the haze of sleep and brought her upright immediately. She listened. The voice said something she couldn't make out. Mrs. Calloway said something back, low and careful. The other voice said, "They're saying she made it all up, that Pike never—" Corinne got up and went downstairs. The woman in Mrs. Calloway's front room was perhaps 45, with a practical face and clothing that had been mended too many times to be anything other than a statement about her circumstances. She stopped talking when Corinne appeared on the stairs and looked at her with an expression that contained several things at once, none of them simple. "This is Agnes Cole," Mrs. Calloway said. Her husband Jonas works for Pike's freight operation. Corinne nodded at Agnes Cole. What are they saying? Agnes Cole looked at her steadily. There's a group of men at the saloon, Pike's men, some of them, saying you stole private documents and you made up what was in them, saying you're a woman who arrived with a grudge over a dead man and you've poisoned the judge's mind. She paused, saying when Pike gets out, and he will get out, things are going to be very different for anyone who helped you. Corinne sat down in the chair across from her. And you came here because? Agnes Cole's jaw tightened. Because my husband Jonas has been afraid of Pike for 2 years and hasn't slept properly since last autumn, and because I want to know if what you found is real. It's real, Corinne said. Can you prove it to someone like me? Someone who doesn't read books? Yes, she said. I can explain it in plain language. So she did. She sat in Mrs. Calloway's front room with the notebook open on her knee, and she explained it without jargon, without anything abstract, naming names that Agnes Cole recognized and amounts that made sense in the context of a woman who understood frontier land values because she lived on frontier land. Agnes Cole listened with her hands folded in her lap and her face doing nothing dramatic, just processing, the way a careful person processed information they knew was going to require them to make a decision they couldn't unmake. Mitchell Reeve, she said when Corinne got to the 5th entry. His wife Clara is my neighbor. She always believed there was something wrong about how he died. Pike's men told her it was his heart. She looked at the notebook. She's been told that for 2 years. She may be called as a witness, Corinne said. Anyone who has information about any of these men could be important to what happens next. Agnes Cole sat with that for a moment. Then she stood up. I'm going to talk to Clara Reeve, she said. I'd appreciate that, Corinne said. After she left, Mrs. Calloway stood in the doorway to the kitchen and looked at Corinne without saying anything for a moment. One at a time, Corinne said. One at a time, Mrs. Calloway agreed and went back to her kitchen. By mid-afternoon, the situation in Black Ridge had settled into an uneasy standoff that everyone in the town felt, but nobody was talking about directly. On one side of it was the courthouse, where Holloway was working methodically through the land records and Corinne's documentation, building the formal case that would need to survive legal scrutiny. On the other side was the saloon, where a core of Pike's loyalists had been drinking since mid-morning and getting louder in increments, their version of events growing more elaborate with each round. Corinne heard about the saloon situation from Tommy, Mrs. Calloway's boy, who had apparently appointed himself an informal intelligence service and arrived at the back door every hour with updates about what he'd observed, delivered with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a child who understood that this was serious business and had decided to be useful about it. They're saying Boone Haskell never hit anybody, Tommy reported at 3 o'clock. They're saying the judge is a drunk and you paid him. Where are they getting that? Silas asked. He had come back sometime in the early afternoon and settled into the kitchen chair like a man who had decided this was where he was going to be for the duration. Tommy shrugged. Galt's back from Millhaven. He's been in and out of the saloon for the past hour. Corinne and Silas looked at each other. He sent messages this morning, Silas said. Now he's back. That's fast for a response. Unless the response was already arranged, she said. Unless the message was just a signal. The implication of that sat between them for a moment. If Pike had prearranged contacts, lawyers, officials, paid witnesses, in anticipation of exactly this kind of situation, then what Holloway had in the courthouse, solid as it was about to be challenged from multiple directions at once. I need to talk to Holloway again, she said. Silas was already standing. I'll take you. They went out the back the same way Silas had come in the night before, and cut around behind the livery and approached the courthouse from the side street rather than the main road. It was not a dramatic maneuver, but it was a sensible one, and Corinne had learned over the past several days that sensible mattered more than dramatic, almost every time. Holloway was at the main table with his clerk and 3 stacks of documents when they came in. He looked up at Corinne without surprise. I was about to send for you, he said. Galt came to see me an hour ago. What did he want? To inform me that Pike intends to claim the ledger was fabricated, that the property transfers were all legitimate, and the documentation proving it is in the hands of his business partners in Denver. He set his pen down. He was very calm about it. He's been calm about everything since the moment I met him, Corinne said. He also informed me that two of the men listed in your notebook as deceased were, in fact, in contact with Pike's Denver office as recently as last year. She felt something cold move through her. That's not possible. He has correspondence. Signed. He showed me copies. She sat down across from him. Show me. Holloway passed her a sheet of paper. She read it carefully. It was a letter dated 14 months ago, signed with the name Daniel Forsyth. The seventh entry in her notebook, listed as deceased 3 years prior, 'cause listed in the ledger as drowning. She read the signature again. Then she read the letter itself, and something in the language of it caught her, a phrasing she'd noticed before in a different context. This was written by someone who knew what Daniel Forsyth's name was, she said slowly, but not how he wrote. Holloway looked at her. Explain. Forsyth was a rancher from Illinois originally. Before he came west, he worked a granary. You can see it in how frontier men from that background write. They use specific terms for weights and measures because they learned to think in those units. It's habitual. She looked at the letter again. This letter refers to the land as approximately 40 acres. A man who worked a granary his whole early life doesn't say approximately. He says the number. He always says the number. Holloway was quiet. I'm not saying that's proof, she said. I'm saying it's a detail worth examining. If you can find any other letter actually written by Daniel Forsyth, a bill of sale, a deed, anything, and compare the phrasing, you'll see the difference. And where would I find something Forsyth actually wrote? Land records, she said immediately. Every property transfer requires a signature and usually a written acknowledgement. The Land Records Office will have his filing from when he originally claimed his property. That was written by him, not by whoever wrote this. Holloway looked at his clerk. The clerk was already getting his coat. Silas, standing near the door, said nothing. He had a way of being present without inserting himself, and she'd started to find it useful rather than strange. While the clerk was gone, Holloway told her the rest of what Galt had brought. There were affidavits, allegedly, from 3 witnesses who would testify that the loans Pike had extended were legitimate and that each property owner had been given full opportunity to repay before foreclosure. There was a statement from a physician in Millhaven, a Dr. Ames, who would testify that the deaths in question had all been examined and found to be natural causes. Corinne listened to all of it and felt the familiar cold focus that settled over her when she was working a set of numbers that someone had tried to manipulate. It was the same feeling as finding an erasure in a ledger, a number written over another number. That particular alertness that came with the recognition that someone had been in here before you and moved things around. He's had this prepared, she said. These affidavits, this physician, he's had this prepared for some time. That's my read as well, Holloway said, which means he's been afraid of this for some time, which means he's known all along that what he built could fall apart. She looked at the original ledger on the table. He kept that ledger because he needed it for his own records. He needed to track which properties transferred when for his own accounting. But he was afraid someone would find it, so he had a counter-story ready. Counter-stories can be effective, Holloway said. Not if the original documentation is clean and the counter-story has holes, she said. What's in that ledger is in his own hand. He can't claim it was fabricated. It's his writing. What he can claim is that it reflects legitimate transactions. What we have to show is that the pattern makes that impossible. The clerk came back 40 minutes later with 2 documents from the Land Records Office, Forsyth's original claim filing and a bill of sale from 5 years prior. Corinne read them both quickly and then picked up Galt's letter and read it again. Here, she said, laying all 3 side by side. She pointed to a specific section of each. In both authentic documents, Forsyth lists his acreage as 43 1/8 acres, not approximately 40, not about 40. 43 1/8 exactly, every single time he references his property. It's the kind of precision a man has with the thing that represents everything he owns. She tapped Galt's letter. This says approximately 40. No man who has spent 5 years on 43 1/8 acres writes approximately 40. Holloway looked at the documents for a long time. It's not conclusive. No, she agreed. It's one piece. But one piece becomes significant when it's consistent with everything else. And everything else is consistent with everything else. And the only thing that isn't consistent is the story Galt brought in. Holloway nodded slowly. He looked tired, the way men looked when they were carrying the weight of a decision that had too many variables and not enough certainty. She understood that. She'd been living in that condition for 3 weeks. "I'm going to need you in this courthouse tomorrow morning," he said. "I'll be here," she said. When they came back outside, the main street had shifted again. The men from the feed store were gone. In their place, outside the general store, there was a different cluster. Women, mostly. 4 or 5 of them in conversation that had the particular quality of people who have stopped being afraid long enough to be angry. She recognized Agnes Cole in the group. Next to her was a smaller woman with a dark dress and a face that showed the specific exhaustion of someone who had been grieving for a long time and had recently been told they might have reason to stop accepting what they'd been told about why. Clara Reeve, she guessed. Mitchell Reeve's widow. 2 years of being told it was his heart. Agnes Cole saw Corinne and gave her a brief nod. Not warm exactly, but direct. Acknowledging. Corinne nodded back and kept walking. Then came Friday night, which nobody planned for and nobody was ready for, and which changed everything again. Corinne had been invited, formally by Holloway's clerk, to come to the courthouse the following morning at 8 o'clock to begin the process of formal deposition. She had spent the evening at Mrs. Calloway's reviewing her notes and organizing her thoughts and trying to eat a meal that she kept putting down because her stomach was doing what her face refused to do. Silas came by at 6. He looked like he hadn't slept, which was plausible because she doubted she would have either. "Galt's been busy," he said, sitting down. He laid his hat on the table and turned it over in his hands, which was the closest thing to nervous energy she'd seen from him. "He's got people talking. The men in the saloon have been there all afternoon. There's a mood building." "What kind of mood?" "The kind that tells itself it's about justice but is actually about fear," he said. "Some of those men think if Pike goes down, their loans go with him. That the bank in Denver that Pike used will call everything in at once and they'll lose their places." "That's not how it works," she said. "I know that. You know that. They don't know that, and Galt is not explaining it to them." She thought about that. "Is Sheriff Henderson aware of what's in the saloon?" "Henderson's been in there twice," Silas said, talking it down as best he can. She thought about Henderson, his compromised position, his departed brother-in-law, his face that didn't do much. He was doing the right thing today. That still counted for something. "I need to go see Holloway about Galt's witnesses," she said. "This afternoon, not tomorrow morning. If he can get ahead of those affidavits before the deposition." "Holloway's at the hotel," Silas said. "He took a room there after the office closed." She grabbed her coat. They walked to Pike's hotel, former hotel, perhaps, depending on how the legal proceedings went, and found Holloway in the dining room with a plate of food he didn't appear to be eating, going over documents with his clerk. Corinne sat down across from him without waiting to be invited. "Dr. Ames," she said, "the physician in Millhaven who signed the death certificates." Holloway looked up. "What about him? How long has he been practicing in Millhaven?" "I'd have to check." "I'm asking because 3 of the men on that list, Forsyth, Reeve, Crane, died in the Black Ridge area, not in Millhaven. The local physician at the time was a man named Pryor, who retired 2 years ago." She looked at him steadily. "Pryor signed the original death certificates. I saw the name on the transfer documents. So why is a Millhaven physician providing testimony about deaths he wasn't present for in a town he doesn't practice in?" Holloway set down his fork. "That's the question," she said. "And the answer to it is either that Ames has access to records Pryor kept, which means we need to find Pryor and verify, or that Ames has no legitimate basis for his testimony and Galt is presenting fabricated medical evidence, which is a different problem entirely, but not a smaller one." Holloway looked at her for a moment. "Do you know where Pryor is?" "Retired 2 years ago, according to what I've heard in town. Mrs. Calloway might know." He looked at his clerk. The clerk wrote something. "Miss Ashcroft," Holloway said, "how do you keep track of all of this?" "The same way you keep track of a set of books," she said. "You know what's supposed to be there, and you notice when something isn't." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "I need you to understand something. Even with everything you've provided, and even with what we've found today, this is not going to be a simple proceeding. Pike has resources. Galt is good at his work. This is going to take time, and during that time you're going to be a visible person in a town where visible people attract attention. I've been a visible person for 3 weeks, she said. I'm still here. You had the advantage of invisibility for most of those 3 weeks. Yes, she said. I don't have that anymore. He studied her face. Are you all right with that? She thought about it honestly. No, she said. But being all right with something isn't required for doing it, in my experience. He almost did that almost smile again. 8 o'clock, he said. Don't be late. She and Silas walked back out into the evening, and the evening had taken on that particular Friday quality that frontier towns developed when the week's frustrations had built up, and the saloon had been open since morning, and there was something unresolved in the air that everyone could feel but nobody could quite name. She should have gone straight back to Mrs. Calloway's. Instead, she stopped on the boardwalk in front of the hotel because she could hear voices from the saloon across the street, and the voices had a pitch to them that she recognized. Not the steady hum of men drinking and talking, but the elevated, uneven sound of a crowd that was building itself toward something. We should go, Silas said, low. I know, she said. But she stood there another moment, listening, trying to measure it. Through the saloon's front windows, she could see movement. Men standing, not sitting, which always changed the character of a crowd. Someone was talking loudly, but she couldn't make out the words. Then there was a burst of something. Not quite agreement, not quite anger, somewhere between the two. Then the saloon doors swung open and Pike's attorney Galt walked out onto the boardwalk opposite, and he looked across the street and saw Corinne standing there. And for a moment the two of them just looked at each other across the width of the road in the fading evening light. Galt smiled. It was the professional smile of a man who knew he was good at his work and was confident in what was coming. He tilted his head slightly, something that might have been a greeting or might have been a signal, and went back inside. Now we go, Silas said. She went. They were halfway back to Mrs. Denny Calloway's, cutting along the side street the way they'd come, when she heard the saloon doors open again behind them. Multiple sets of feet this time, and voices that had gotten louder. She didn't look back. She kept walking. Silas put his hand briefly on her elbow, guiding her around the corner and into the alley between the mercantile and the hardware store, and they stood in the shadow there for a moment while a group of men moved past on the main street, heading in the direction of the courthouse. She counted 8 of them, from what she could see through the gap between buildings. 6 she didn't recognize. 2 she did. They'd been among the men outside the feed store that morning, watching her come out of the courthouse. They're going to make noise outside the courthouse, Silas said quietly. Try to make Holloway uncomfortable. Will it work? He thought about it. Holloway's been riding circuit for 20 years. He's seen angry crowds before. He paused. But crowds have a way of escalating past what people intend. She leaned carefully around the edge of the building and watched the group reach the courthouse. They weren't violent, not yet, not quite, but they were loud. And their loudness had that specific quality of people who were auditioning for violence, working up to it, checking whether the performance would be required. She heard shouting. She couldn't make out the words. She saw a light go on in the courthouse's upper window. Then she heard the saloon doors open again. More people, but these ones were going the other direction, toward the general store, toward the boarding house end of town, spreading out rather than gathering. Some of them were women. She saw Clara Reeve in the group, moving quickly, and Agnes Cole beside her, and 3 men she didn't know who walked with the purposeful pace of people who had decided something. What are they doing? She asked. Going to get more people, Silas said. She watched and understood that Black Ridge was doing what towns sometimes did under pressure, splitting itself along whatever fault lines had always been there, pulling apart at the seams of old decisions and old silences and old accommodations, and the split was happening now, tonight, in real time, and she was standing in an alley watching it happen, and she had started it by showing up here 3 weeks ago with a trunk and $42. That was not a comfortable thing to be responsible for, but the uncomfortable truths were still truths. She was about to say they should move when she heard something from the saloon that stopped her. Not shouting, the opposite. A sudden, specific silence, the kind that a room made when something had changed inside it. Then the saloon doors opened, slowly this time, and one person walked out. He was tall and lean, and he walked with his hands open at his sides, not reaching for anything, not performing anything, just moving with the same quality of attention he always had, building the picture, reading the room, placing himself in it with deliberate intent. Silas walked directly across the main street and through the crowd that had gathered outside the courthouse, not around them, but through them. And people moved without being asked, the way water moved around something solid, and he reached the courthouse steps and turned around and faced the crowd. He didn't say anything, he just stood there, looking at them. And the crowd, which had been loud and building and edging itself toward something it couldn't entirely name, went quiet in a way that changed its own momentum. Because there was something about a man who was genuinely unafraid of you that made a crowd uncertain of itself. Crowds needed the performance of authority, shouting, demanding, being responded to. A man who looked at them and simply waited was a different problem entirely. Corinne watched from the shadow of the alley. She felt something complex. Gratitude and something else she wasn't naming yet. Something about how it felt to watch a person put themselves between something they believed in and the thing that was threatening it, without noise, without declaration, just by being there. Someone in the crowd said something. She couldn't hear it. Silas looked in the direction it came from and said something back, quiet, too quiet to carry to her position. Whatever it was, it changed the pitch of the crowd. Not dissolving it. You couldn't dissolve that kind of mood with words, but interrupting its momentum, making it reconsider, buying time for the thing that was building on the other side of town to arrive. The other side of town arrived 10 minutes later. Clara Reeve and Agnes Cole and the three unknown men, and behind them, gradually, 8 more people, ranchers, families, people who had debts or histories or dead relatives or all three, coming along the main street toward the courthouse with a different quality of purpose entirely. They didn't confront the crowd that was already there. They simply arrived and stood near the courthouse steps, and the courthouse steps were already occupied by Silas, and the crowd found itself looking at one side of the steps, and then the other side of the steps, and the mathematics of the situation had changed without anyone throwing a punch. From the alley, Corinne watched it balance out, watched the crowd's momentum stall, watched 2 of the original 8 men detach from the group and walk away down the side street without looking at each other, watched the rest begin to disperse in 1s and 2s, the way a crowd dissolved when it ran out of the particular fuel it needed. She let out a breath she'd been holding for what felt like several minutes. Then the courthouse door opened and Holloway appeared at the top of the steps, and he looked at the remaining people on his steps and on his street with the expression of a circuit judge who has seen this before and knows exactly what it means. And he said, loudly and clearly into the evening air, "This courthouse opens at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Anyone with legitimate business before the court is welcome at that time. Anyone currently standing in this street would do well to go home." He went back inside. The remaining crowd stood there for a moment longer, then finished dispersing. The Friday night sound of Black Ridge settled back into itself. Lower now, more subdued, the saloon going quiet with the particular quietness of people who had worked themselves up and then hadn't done anything and weren't sure what to do with the energy that remained. Corinne walked out of the alley. She crossed the main street. She stopped at the courthouse steps where Silas was still standing, watching the last of the crowd disperse. "That was useful," she said. "For tonight," he said. He wasn't inflating it. "Yes," she agreed, "for tonight." She looked at him for a moment, the scrape on his cheekbone from the night before, the split knuckles, the face that was tired in a way it probably hadn't been tired before he rode into this valley to find out why his second cousin had stopped writing. "Get some sleep," she said. "Tomorrow is going to need both of us." He nodded once. He walked toward the livery without looking back. She went back to Mrs. Calloway's, and she went to her actual room this time, not the cellar, and she lay down fully dressed on top of the covers with the notebook still inside her coat, and she listened to Black Ridge settle back into itself outside the window. And she thought about 8 o'clock in the morning and the deposition and the 14 names in the ledger and Galt's professional smile across the road. Sleep came slowly and stayed light, and she dreamed about numbers that kept changing when she looked at them, which was the kind of dream she always had before something important, and which she had never once found comforting. She was at the courthouse at 7:45, which was 15 minutes early, which was how she did everything. Holloway's clerk was already there, sorting documents into stacks with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had been doing this work long enough that the gravity of what was in the papers no longer registered on his face. He looked up when she came in, nodded once, and went back to sorting. She sat in the chair she'd sat in the day before and put her notebook on the table and waited. At 5 minutes to 8, Silas arrived. He didn't come in. He stood at the doorway for a moment, looked at her, and then positioned himself outside to the right of the door, where she could see him through the window if she needed to. She appreciated that. It was exactly the right instinct, to be visible from inside without being inside, available without being present in a way that would complicate the proceedings. Holloway came down from upstairs at exactly 8 o'clock with the original ledger under one arm and a look on his face that told her he hadn't slept much either and had arrived at a set of decisions in the night that he was prepared to act on. He sat down. He opened the ledger. He looked at her. "Before we begin," he said, "I want to tell you what I found after you left last evening." She waited. "My clerk located Dr. Pryor, the physician who signed the original death certificates, at his daughter's house in Millhaven. He's 71 and his eyesight is failing, but his memory is sound." He paused. "He told my clerk that he was visited 3 years ago by a man claiming to be a medical inspector from the county. This man asked to review all of Pryor's records for the past 4 years. Pryor allowed it. He said the man seemed legitimate and professional. He said the records were returned to him intact." Another pause. 2 weeks after that visit, the Millhaven physician Ames began countersigning copies of Pryor's death certificates for cases he had never personally examined. Corinne was quiet for a moment. "Galt's man," she said. "Almost certainly. Pryor never saw Ames, never authorized him, never knew it was happening." Holloway looked at the table. "Pryor is very old and very angry and would like to come to Blackridge and say all of this under oath." "Can he travel?" "He says he can. His daughter disagrees. We're working on it." She absorbed this. The picture she'd been building since she first looked at that ledger was getting denser, more interconnected, and with each new connection it became harder for Galt to claim any single piece was isolated or coincidental. A falsified medical countersignature was not an accident, it was infrastructure. It meant the cover story had been built in advance and maintained systematically, the same way the fraud itself had been built and maintained. "He planned all of this," she said, "not just the individual transactions, the entire protection system around it." "Yes," Holloway said. "That's consistent with 14 cases over 4 years. You don't maintain that kind of operation by improvising." She thought about Pike in his hotel, with his reasonable voice and his pale eyes and his unhurried manner. 4 years of this. 14 families. The sheer patience of it was the thing that kept catching her. The methodical, sustained quality of what he'd done. The fact that it had required constant management and constant maintenance, and that he'd done it anyway, because the land was worth it, and the people who owned it were not, in his calculation, worth very much at all. "I'm ready to give my deposition," she said. It took 4 hours. Holloway asked every question she'd expected and several she hadn't, probing at the edges of what she'd observed and what she'd inferred and where the line was between them. She was scrupulous about that line. She told him what she'd seen with her own eyes and what she'd copied from the ledger and what she'd calculated from the data. And whenever he pushed her toward an interpretation she wasn't certain of, she said she wasn't certain and offered what she was certain of instead. She'd worked with lawyers before, at Hartwell and Sons, and she knew that the ones who were good at their work wanted precision, not drama. Holloway was good at his work. He didn't want her to tell him Pike was a monster. He wanted her to tell him, specifically and verifiably, what was in that ledger and what she knew about how she'd found it and why she believed it was accurate. She told him everything. At one point, he asked her to walk him through the exact sequence of how she'd accessed the locked cabinet, and she did without apology, including the hairpin and the 11 minutes and the 27 minutes of copying and the 4 minutes to relock it. He looked at her when she finished that section. You understand that the manner in which this evidence was obtained is something Galt will use. I know, she said. I'd make the same choice again. That may come up. I know that too. He wrote for a moment without speaking. Then, why didn't you leave after the first time someone stood outside your door? She thought about it, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wanted to give it to him accurately. Because leaving would have meant the ledger disappeared, she said. And if the ledger disappeared, 14 families would spend the rest of their lives being told their fathers or husbands died of accidents and fevers and bad water. And Dorian Pike would find 14 more. She paused. I'm a bookkeeper. I know what it means when the numbers are wrong. It means someone is stealing and someone is being stolen from. And the person doing the stealing is counting on nobody looking closely enough to see it. I look closely. It's the thing I do. Holloway set his pen down and looked at her for a moment. Not the recalibrating look from before. Something different. Something that might have been, in a different man in a different context, the expression you made when you encountered something that moved you and didn't quite know what to do with that. He picked his pen back up. Continue, he said. She continued. At noon, his clerk brought food, bread and cold meat and coffee, and they ate quickly and kept working. At 2 in the afternoon, Holloway called a stop and sent the clerk to make copies of the key sections of the deposition, and he and Corinne sat across from each other with the remains of lunch between them and the particular exhaustion of people who had been concentrating very hard for a long time. Galt's going to file a motion this afternoon to have Pike released on bond, Holloway said. Will you grant it? No, he said. Not yet. The risk of flight is too significant, and I need to bring in testimony from outside Black Ridge before the formal hearing. He looked at the ledger. I'm going to send for a state marshal's representative. This is beyond a circuit matter at this point. The scope of it crosses county lines, and the Denver connection needs to be examined by someone with broader jurisdiction. How long will that take? 3 days? Maybe 4? 3 or 4 more days in Black Ridge. She thought about Galt's professional smile, about the men who'd gathered outside the courthouse last night, about the fact that Pike was in a cell and his entire operation was suspended, and there were people in this town whose livelihoods had depended on that operation and who were now in an uncertain position that frightened them. I'll be here, she said. What she didn't say, and what Holloway probably already understood, was that 3 or 4 days was a long time when the situation on the ground was as unstable as Black Ridge's currently was. The instability announced itself again at 4 o'clock, when Henderson came to the courthouse looking like a man who had been arguing with himself all morning and had reached a conclusion that he wasn't entirely comfortable with. He sat down across from Holloway. He put his hands flat on the table, which Corinne had noticed was what he did when he was being deliberate about something. I need to tell you something, he said, about the Pike operation. Holloway waited. There were payments, Henderson said. To me. Not large ones, and not... I want to be clear that I never... He stopped. Reorganized. I accepted payments from Pike over 3 years, monthly, for what he called security coordination. I told myself it was a legitimate arrangement. He looked at the table. I knew it wasn't. The room was quiet. Those payments stopped when you arrived, he told Holloway, because the arrangement required that certain things be handled locally and not escalated to the circuit level. I couldn't control what came to the circuit level. He looked up. I'm telling you this because Galt is going to bring it up. He told me this morning he intends to use it to argue that the investigation itself is compromised because local law enforcement was implicated. He's going to try to make it look like I've turned on Pike to save myself, and therefore everything I've done in the past 2 days, securing the office, arresting Boone, providing access to the ledger, was self-interested and should be excluded. Holloway was very still. He may be right that it was self-interested, Henderson said, but the ledger is real and the arrests are legal, and what I did was correct regardless of why I did it. He looked at Holloway steadily. I'm prepared to give a full statement about the payments, about what I knew and when I knew it, all of it. Another silence. You understand what that means for you, Holloway said. Yes, Henderson said. I do. Corinne looked at Henderson's face, which was doing more than it usually did. The careful, impassive surface had cracked, Not dramatically, but enough to see what was underneath, which was a man who had been living with a wrong thing for 3 years and had reached the point where the weight of it was worse than the consequence of admitting it. "All right," Holloway said. "My clerk will take your statement." Henderson nodded once and stood up. He looked at Corinne briefly. Not an apology, not quite, but an acknowledgement of some kind, and then went with the clerk to the next room. When they were alone, Holloway looked at her. "That changes things," he said. "Galt can't use Henderson's corruption to discredit the investigation if Henderson is already on record about it," she said. "Exactly." He paused. "It also means this case just got considerably larger and considerably more public. Henderson's statement will have to be part of the formal record. It implicates the structure of law enforcement in this entire county." She thought about what that meant, not just for Pike, not just for the 14 families, but for the whole apparatus that had allowed 4 years of this. The circuit court system, the appointment of county sheriffs, the oversight of property records. "Is that a problem?" "It's a complication," he said, "but complications that expose the truth are generally better than simple stories that don't." She nodded. "Then let it be complicated." He almost smiled. The next day and a half were the kind of slow, tense hours that didn't make good stories, but that were the actual texture of how things like this moved. Meetings in courthouse rooms, documents examined and cross-referenced, Holloway's clerk making trips back and forth between the courthouse and the land records office, and back again, a slow accumulation of confirmations that built the case the way you built anything solid, one load-bearing piece at a time. Galt filed his motion to release Pike on bond. Holloway denied it. Galt filed an objection. Holloway denied that too, and noted his reasoning in the record in language that was measured and impersonal and completely unambiguous about where he stood. Corinne was present for some of it and absent from other parts of it, depending on whether she was needed. When she wasn't needed in the courthouse, she was useful in other ways, talking to the people Agnes Cole and Clara Reeve had assembled, the ones with personal knowledge of the men in the ledger, helping them understand what they'd be asked to say and how to say it and why the specific details mattered. There was a woman named Ruth Halsey, whose father was the 12th entry in the ledger, and Ruth Halsey was 40 years old with 3 grown children and 20 years of believing her father had drunk himself to death, which was what she'd been told by the man who'd been managing his property on behalf of his estate before the estate was quietly absorbed into Pike's holdings. She sat across from Corinne at Mrs. Calloway's kitchen table and listened while Corinne explained what the ledger showed, and her face went through several stages that Corinne watched carefully and gave space to, because some of those stages needed space. "He didn't drink," Ruth Halsey said finally. "I know," Corinne said. "Everyone said he drank. I believed it because—" She stopped. "Because it was easier. To believe he'd failed himself than to believe someone had—" She stopped again. Corinne waited. "I have letters he wrote me," Ruth Halsey said. "In the months before he died. He was worried about his loan with Pike. He said something was wrong with the terms, but he couldn't figure out what." She looked at Corinne. "Would those letters matter?" "Yes," Corinne said immediately. "Very much." Ruth Halsey nodded once, with the specific nod of a person who has just found something to do with a grief they'd been carrying in a form that had no outlet. That was the Tuesday. On Wednesday morning, the state marshal's representative arrived. A man named Aldridge, compact and unimpressive looking in the specific way of people who had spent years in rooms where impressiveness would have been a liability. He met with Holloway for 3 hours. He asked to review the ledger and the deposition and the land records. He met with Henderson for a separate hour. Corinne was not in those meetings. She sat in the outer room and read through her notebook for the dozenth time, not because she thought she'd missed anything, but because the act of going through it systematically was the thing that kept her steady. Silas came by at noon with coffee from the diner, which he handed her without comment and sat down beside her. "Aldridge sent 2 telegrams this morning," he said. "Tommy saw him at the telegraph office." "To Denver?" "One to Denver. One to the state capitol." She absorbed this. "He's taking it seriously." "Looks that way." He drank his own coffee. "Galt is nervous. I watched him come out of the hotel this morning, and he looked like a man who'd been recalculating all night. He should be nervous, she said. He built a counterstory on a foundation that didn't hold. Counterstories don't have to hold, Silas said. They just have to buy time. Not this time, she said. He looked at her. You sound certain. I am certain, she said. The foundation is the ledger, his own handwriting, his own records, kept by him for his own purposes. Everything else we've found connects to it and confirms it. Galt can challenge the manner of discovery. He can challenge my credibility. He can challenge Henderson's credibility. But he can't challenge the ledger itself without claiming Pike fabricated his own records. And if he makes that claim, he has to explain why a man would fabricate records documenting his own crimes. Silas was quiet for a moment. What if Galt claims someone else put the ledger there? She'd thought about this. Then we need Galt to make that claim officially in the record so that it can be examined. Because if he makes that claim, the question becomes who and when and how they gained access to a locked cabinet inside a locked office. And the only person documented as having accessed that office is me, in the period after the arrests, under Holloway's authority. She paused. So the chain of custody is clean from the point of discovery forward. Before that point, the question is whether the ledger's contents match the property records independently. They do. I checked them myself against the land records, and so did Holloway's clerk, and so did Aldridge this morning. He looked at her for a long moment. You've been building this all week. I've been building this for 3 weeks, she said. Since the morning I stood at Owen Mercer's fence. He nodded. He looked down at his coffee cup. Owen would have been glad to know you, he said. He'd have liked you. She didn't know exactly what to do with that, so she just nodded. The afternoon of the 3rd day was when things accelerated the way they did, when enough pieces were in place that the structure began to move under its own momentum. Aldridge called Galt to a formal meeting. Corinne wasn't present, but Holloway told her afterward what had happened. Galt had arrived with his counter affidavits and his fabricated Forsyth letter and his Millhaven physician, and Aldridge had laid on the table, in order, the original Forsyth land filings, the statement from the retired Dr. Pryor, and a telegraph response from the Denver business office that Pike had claimed as his verification. A response that said, flatly and in writing, that they had no record of correspondence with any Daniel Forsyth in the past 3 years. Galt had looked at that telegraph for a long time. He asked for a recess, Holloway said. 30 minutes? Did Aldridge give it to him? He gave him 20. She thought about Galt and whatever room he'd gone to for those 20 minutes, with the professional competence that had built Pike's counterstory, running up against the fact that the counterstory had just been taken apart, piece by piece, in a room with a state marshal's representative. Galt was good at his work. He knew what this looked like. He came back, Holloway continued, and he asked about the terms of cooperation. The room went quiet in a specific way. He's going to give up Pike, she said. He's going to give up everything, Holloway said. The Denver connection, the other properties, names of other officials in other counties who received payments. All of it. A pause. In exchange for consideration of his own exposure, she sat with that for a moment. It was not the clean outcome she'd have chosen. Galt had known what he was enabling and had enabled it efficiently and professionally for years, and the idea of him negotiating his way to a reduced consequence sat uncomfortably. But what he was giving up was larger than his individual culpability, and the people whose names he was providing would not have expected to be exposed through their own attorney. It's the right call, she said, not because she liked it. Yes, Holloway said. That was Wednesday afternoon. By Wednesday evening, the state marshal's office had enough to issue a formal arrest warrant for Pike on charges that went considerably beyond what the original ledger showed: fraud, conspiracy, forgery, and what the warrant described as conduct resulting in unlawful death, which was the legal formulation for what everyone in Black Ridge had started calling by its right name when they thought they weren't being overheard. Boone Haskell, in his cell, received a visit from Aldridge that same evening. Whatever was said in that room, Boone came out of it as a formal state witness rather than just an arrested man, and the assault on Corinne moved from a local matter to a state one. She heard about all of this from Holloway in pieces, as each piece was confirmed. She sat in the courthouse waiting room between updates, and she thought about the 14 families and the widow in Amarillo and Ruth Halsey's letters from her father and the specific quality of relief that hadn't arrived yet, that she was still waiting for, like a sound she could feel coming but hadn't heard yet. On Thursday morning, everything converged. Aldridge held a formal session in the courthouse at 9 o'clock. He seated himself at the front table with Holloway beside him. Sheriff Henderson was present, formally and with the knowledge of his own pending consequences, which gave him a kind of stripped-down steadiness that she found she respected more than his earlier careful neutrality. 2 of Henderson's deputies were posted at the doors. The public was not excluded. Holloway had made a decision about that, and when Corinne asked him why, he said simply, "This town deserves to see it." So the people came. Not the saloon crowd. Those men were notable by their absence, or their presence only at the very back, watching without the energy of the night outside the courthouse. The people who came and filled the room were the others. The women from Agnes Cole's gathering, the ranchers who'd been afraid to talk for 2 years, Ruth Halsey, with her father's letters in her hands, Clara Reeve beside her, and behind them, standing near the door because sitting felt wrong, Silas. Galt entered without his professional confidence, which was more telling than anything else. He sat at the side table and looked at a point in the middle distance and said nothing. Then the door at the back opened and 2 of Aldridge's men brought Pike in. He was dressed as neatly as he always was, the clothes still good, the jaw still square, the pale eyes still working the room. But something had shifted in the quality of his calm. The old calm had been the calm of a man who knew he was in control. This was the calm of a man performing control, and she could see the performance, the deliberate construction of it, because she'd spent enough time looking at things carefully to know the difference. He saw her. She was seated to the right of the main table, with her notebook in front of her and her hands flat on the table, and her face arranged into the same neutral attention she'd used when she'd stood at Owen Mercer's fence. He looked at her for a long moment. The pale eyes did something complicated. She looked back at him without expression. She had nothing to perform. She'd done the work, and the work was on the table and in the record, and in Holloway's files and in Aldridge's telegraph, and there was nothing left that required her to be anything other than what she was. Pike sat down. Aldridge opened the session with the flat procedural language of a man who had done this many times and knew that precision mattered more than drama. He read the charges. He noted the formal record. He explained the state's position and the evidence underlying it. Then he read from Galt's cooperation agreement. The room went very quiet. Galt's agreement described, in organized and professional language, the full architecture of what Pike had built, the loan structure designed to create unpayable debt, the timeline for property transfer, the arrangement with the Millhaven physician, the payments to local officials, the contacts in Denver, the names of 4 other counties where similar operations had been conducted or attempted. It was read aloud in a courthouse in Black Ridge, an extraordinary document, not because of the crimes it described, though those were significant, but because of the care with which it described them, the organizational clarity of a man who had spent years facilitating something and understood it completely. It took 40 minutes to read in full. When Aldridge finished, the room stayed quiet for another moment. Then someone toward the back made a sound. Not quite a sob, not quite something else, some compressed and long-held thing releasing at once. And then other sounds followed it. And then Henderson's deputies had to ask twice for order before the room settled back. Pike sat through all of it with his hands in his lap and his face doing the performance of calm, and when Aldridge asked him formally whether he understood the charges and the evidence against him, he looked up and said yes in a voice that was measured and level and completely without the unhurried confidence it had carried the morning she'd stood at Owen Mercer's fence. Then Aldridge did something that Holloway had not told her was coming. He looked at Corinne. "Miss Ashcroft," he said, "you've provided the foundational documentation for this proceeding. I want to ask you one question for the record." He paused. "When you accessed the cabinet in Pike's office and copied the entries in this ledger, did you alter, add to, or remove anything from what you found there?" The room was completely still. "No," she said. "I copied exactly what was there, and I left it exactly as I found it." "Thank you," Aldridge said. He moved on, but she was aware, in the stillness after those two words of what had just happened, that the question and the answer were now part of the official record, that they would be read by people who had not been in this room, that the precision and simplicity of that exchange were the cleanest summary of everything she had done for the past 3 weeks. She had not added anything. She had not removed anything. She had looked at what was there and copied it down and brought it to the people who could act on it. That was all. That was the whole of it. Pike was formally remanded to state custody to be transferred to the county seat for trial. Boone Haskell remained in local custody as a state witness with his own arrangements pending. The two men who'd run when the deputies came had been located by Aldridge's people in a town 20 miles east and were being brought back. Galt left the courthouse with the cooperative walk of a man who had traded in everything he knew and was now waiting to find out what that was worth. Corinne sat at the table after most people had gone, and she looked at the ledger, which was still on the table, which she had no right to anymore. It was evidence. It would go with Aldridge. It would be in the record for the trial. Her notebook was still in her hands. 14 entries, in her shorthand, that she had carried under her dress for 2 weeks. She opened it to the first page. The numbers were still clean, every entry exactly as she'd copied it, every date, every name, every amount. She closed it again. Holloway came and sat down beside her, not across, beside, which was different, which was the posture of someone who was done with the formal part and had moved into something else. "The trial will be in the county seat," he said. "You'll be called as a witness. It may be several months. I know. You'll need to decide whether to stay in the territory or provide a forwarding address." She thought about that. About the stage back to St. Louis and the empty position at Hartwell and Sons and the $42 she'd arrived with, most of it still intact because Mrs. Calloway had refused to charge her for the past 10 days. She thought about Owen Mercer's barn and his straight fence lines. "I'll stay," she said. She wasn't entirely sure why or what staying would look like, but the word came out before the uncertainty did, and she let it stand. Holloway nodded. He stood. He picked up the ledger and held it for a moment, that same gesture she'd seen before, weight and significance both. And then he tucked it under his arm and walked out of the courthouse. She sat alone at the table. Through the window, she could see the main street of Black Ridge in the afternoon light, the feed store, the general store, Pike's Hotel, which already had a legal notice posted on the front door in Aldridge's clerk's handwriting, the diner, the water trough that still needed cleaning, the dog cutting across the road at its usual angle, indifferent to everything, entirely unchanged by the upheaval of the past several days. She watched it go and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for 3 weeks. Not completely, not all at once, but enough to notice, like a knot working itself out one strand at a time. She was still sitting there when she heard boots on the courthouse steps, and Silas appeared in the doorway. He looked at her, then at the empty table, then back at her. "It's done?" he said. "The formal part," she said. He came in and sat down across from her, and they were quiet together for a moment, in the way of people who had been through something difficult in parallel and didn't feel the need to narrate it to each other. "What happens now?" he asked. Not to her exactly, more to the room, or to the afternoon, or to the specific condition of being on the other side of something that had taken a long time to get through. "Now there's a trial," she said, "months away probably, and the families get to reclaim what was taken. And somewhere in Amarillo, Lester Crane's widow gets a letter she wasn't expecting." She paused, and Ruth Halsey stops believing her father drank himself to death. Silas was quiet. "What about you?" she asked. He looked at the window. "Warrant's still there," he said. "Unless Aldridge—" "He will," she said. "He has to. It's part of the case. The warrant against you originated from Pike's network. Holloway told me Aldridge's people found the original filing, and it connects directly to a man on Pike's payroll in the county seat who filed false complaints against people Pike needed removed or discredited." He looked at her. "You were one of them," she said. "That's why the warrant never went away. Pike or someone working for him kept it active. Because you were Owen's cousin, and Owen was trouble, and anyone connected to Owen was worth keeping under a cloud." He sat very still. "Aldridge knows," she said. "He asked me about it this morning. I told him what you told me, and he said he'd already found corroboration." She watched his face. "It's going to be voided." What happened to his face then was not dramatic. It wasn't tears or noise or the big release that stories usually put in that moment. It was something smaller and more real, a kind of settling, like a man who had been braced against something for a long time and was now, slowly, beginning to straighten up. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Since this morning." "Why didn't you say something earlier?" She thought about it. "Because there was other work to do first," she said, "and because I thought you'd want to hear it when it was certain, not when it was probable." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, slowly. "Yeah," he said. "That's right." They sat in the empty courthouse in the afternoon light, and outside Black Ridge went on being itself, complicated and imperfect, and scared and angry and slowly, at the edges, beginning to reckon with 4 years of looking the other way and what it would take to do something different. It was not a simple town, and it was not going to have a simple recovery, and nobody in this room had any illusions about that. But the ledger was in Aldridge's possession, and the charges were on the record, and Henderson had given his statement, and Galt had given his names, and Ruth Halsey had her father's letters, and Clara Reeve had stopped being alone with what she'd suspected for 2 years. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the only foundation any of it could be built on. The hard and specific truth of what had actually happened, documented carefully, presented cleanly, placed in front of people who could act on it. Numbers had never lied to her. They weren't lying now. The months that followed were not a clean story. Corinne had known they wouldn't be, but knowing something in the abstract and living it in practice were different things. And she spent the first 2 weeks after Aldridge left with his paperwork and his prisoners learning the difference in a way that got into her bones. The trial was set for late February, which meant roughly 4 months of waiting. 4 months of Black Ridge existing in the specific limbo of a town whose power structure had collapsed, but whose replacement hadn't been determined yet. Henderson was still sheriff, technically, pending the state's review of his cooperation agreement. The land cases were opened but not resolved. Pike's Hotel sat under a legal notice, and nobody knew what would happen to it or to the people who'd been employed there, including the 17-year-old girl at the front desk who'd been sending half her wages home to her mother in Colorado. Corinne knew about the girl's mother because she'd asked. She'd started doing that, asking about the people around the edges of this, the ones whose situations didn't fit cleanly into either the victim's column or the perpetrator's column. The kitchen workers at the hotel, the freight drivers who'd worked for Pike's hauling operation, Jonas Cole, Agnes's husband, who'd done his job competently and honestly, and whose job had now technically ceased to exist. She couldn't fix all of it, she knew that, but she could see it, and she had learned a long time ago that seeing something clearly was not nothing, even when there was nothing immediate you could do with what you saw. She went to see the Mercer Ranch the week after Aldridge left, not the way she'd gone the first morning, standing at the fence, looking from the outside. She went in through the gate and walked the property properly, which she hadn't done before, and she spent 3 hours going through the house and the barn and the fence lines and the outbuildings, taking inventory in her head the way she took inventory of everything, building the picture. The house needed work. Not structural work, Owen had built solidly, but the kind of accumulated maintenance that stopped happening when a man was sick and then gone. A window sash that had swelled and wouldn't close properly. A section of kitchen floor that had a soft spot near the stove. The well casing needed to be checked before winter. None of it was beyond repair. All of it required someone to do it. She walked Owen Mercer's land for 3 hours and thought about what she'd said to Holloway. "I'll stay." The word had come out before the reasoning did, and she'd spent the weeks since trying to understand what it meant. She had no claim on this land. Owen's estate was in probate, complicated by the fraud and the legal proceedings, and it would be months before any of it was resolved. But the property was being held against the outcome of the trial, which meant nobody was living there, which meant nobody was maintaining it, which meant that by spring there would be more wrong with it than there was now. She mentioned this to Holloway when he came back through Black Ridge 2 weeks after the formal session, checking on the status of local proceedings. "Someone should be maintaining it," she said. "The Mercer property, and the others that are in legal hold. If they sit empty through winter, there's going to be nothing worth recovering." Holloway looked at her over his coffee. "That's a problem for the probate court. The probate court is in the county seat, and the county seat is 4 months from resolving anything. The window sash won't wait 4 months. A pause. What are you proposing? A caretaker arrangement. Documented, formally registered with your office, with no claim implied on the property itself. Just someone with the legal right to maintain and occupy in order to preserve the asset for the estate. He looked at her for a long moment. You've already drafted this. She put a sheet of paper on the table. He read it. He was quiet for a moment. This is well constructed. I know, she said. He signed it. She moved into the Mercer Ranch the following Monday with her trunk and her $42, now significantly reduced but not yet gone, and Mrs. Calloway's $6, which she had repaid, and a cast-iron skillet that Mrs. Calloway had pressed on her with the specific insistence of a woman who has decided a thing and will not be talked out of it. I'm not far, Mrs. Calloway said at the door. 2 miles, that's nothing. I know, Corinne said. Thank you, for all of it. Mrs. Calloway made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Fix that window before the cold comes, she said, and went back inside. The ranch was quiet in a way that the boarding house hadn't been, and Corinne found she needed a few days to calibrate to it. The sounds were different. Wind in the barn eaves, the particular creak of a house that was well built but old, the distant sound of cattle from the neighboring Alderson spread that Owen had apparently been on friendly terms with before he got sick. She woke the first 2 mornings at 3 o'clock, with her hand on the notebook that she no longer needed to wear under her dress, a reflex without purpose, and lay in the dark until she could fall back asleep. The window sash she fixed herself, which took 2 hours in a plane, she found in Owen's tool shed, and the memory of watching her father do the same thing when she was 9. The kitchen floor she shimmed from underneath, which was less elegant but functional. The well casing she asked Jonas Cole to look at, because he'd done maintenance work and knew what he was doing, and because she'd learned that asking people for help with the things they were good at was not weakness, it was efficiency. And also it gave Jonas Cole something productive to do during the period when his employment situation was uncertain. Jonas came and looked at the well casing and fixed it in an afternoon and refused payment. His wife Agnes came with him and looked at the house with the assessing eye of someone who had maintained her own place for 20 years and knew what it took. You're serious about staying, Agnes said. It wasn't a question. I'm serious about staying, Corinne confirmed. Agnes looked at her for a moment. Owen was a decent man. He would have been pleased to know someone was taking care of his place. I hope so, Corinne said. He would have been pleased about a lot of things from the past month, Agnes said with a directness that was characteristic of her. Most of us knew something was wrong for a long time. We just didn't do anything about it. She looked at the well casing Jonas was replacing. That's the part that's hard to sit with. Corinne thought about how to answer that honestly. Knowing something is wrong and being able to act on it aren't the same thing, she said finally. You need the right position and the right information and the right moment, and most of the time most people don't have all three at once. You did. I had the right information, Corinne said, and I didn't have enough to lose to be as afraid as I should have been. Agnes looked at her sideways. That's not entirely true. No, she admitted. It's not entirely true. What was true was more complicated than a single explanation, and she'd stopped trying to reduce it to one. She'd been desperate partly. She'd been angry partly. She'd been running on the specific fuel of someone who looks at wrong numbers and cannot let them stand, and that fuel had carried her further than fear should have allowed. Silas came by the ranch on the third day. She heard his horse in the yard and looked out the window and went to the door before he knocked. How's it sitting? He said, looking at the house. It needs work, she said. Come in. He came in and looked at the kitchen the way he looked at everything, methodically, building the picture. He noted the shimmied floor and the fixed window without commenting on either. She made coffee and they sat at Owen's kitchen table, which was solid oak and had probably been in this kitchen since the ranch was built. And she thought about Owen sitting at this table writing letters with his bad handwriting, struggling to say in words what he probably communicated better through the quality of his fence lines. Aldridge confirmed it, Silas said. She looked at him. The warrant. It's been formally voided. I got a letter from the state marshal's office yesterday. He held his coffee cup with both hands. Clean record. She waited to see what his face would do with that information. What it did was something quiet and private and not fully resolved. The look of a man who had spent a long time in one condition and was still learning what it meant to be in a different one. How long has it been following you? She asked. 6 years. 6 years. She thought about what 6 years of a warrant felt like. Every town an assessment of risk, every stranger's face a potential problem, every normal thing freighted with the awareness that your right to be where you were could be challenged at any moment. 6 years of being the man everyone was careful around, the man nobody wanted to be seen associating with, the man whose past was a story someone else had written about him and that he'd been unable to dispute. I'm glad, she said. Simple, direct. He nodded. Me too. What are you going to do? He looked at the window. Outside the kitchen window there was the yard and the barn and the clean November sky that had been getting colder by degrees all week. I'm not sure yet, he said. I've been in motion for so long that stopping feels strange. He paused. I thought about going back, where I came from, originally, but there's not much left there. Where was that? Kansas, small town, family's mostly gone now. He turned his cup in his hands. I've been thinking about staying in the territory. Black Ridge? Maybe, or somewhere near. He looked at her. I know cattle. I worked ranches before the warrant. I could find work. The Alderson spread is looking for a second hand, she said. I heard that from Agnes Cole. He looked at her. You heard that recently? Yesterday, she said. A pause. You heard that and thought of me. I thought someone should mention it, she said. He was quiet for a moment, and then something at the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, something a little more rueful and real than a smile. You're still solving things, he said. I'm noting information that seems relevant, she said. What you do with it is your business. He drank his coffee. She drank hers. Outside the window, the November sky was doing what November skies did, getting serious about themselves, and the cold that came through the walls of the old house was the honest cold of a place that had real winters and didn't apologize for them. The trial opened in late February in the county seat, in a courthouse considerably larger than Black Ridge's, with a judge who had been specifically assigned from outside the region because the presiding state court had rightly determined that impartiality required distance from 4 years of tangled local history. Corinne took the stage to the county seat on a Monday morning with her notebook and a clean copy of her deposition and the specific, grounded nerves of someone who has prepared thoroughly and knows it. She'd been over her testimony so many times that the sequence of it was as automatic as breathing, but she still went through it once more on the stage, because preparation was a habit, and habits didn't take days off. She was in the county seat for 11 days. The trial was not simple. Galt's cooperation hadn't neutralized Pike's defense team, which had been supplemented by 2 attorneys from Denver, who were competent and aggressive and made several motions in the first 3 days that were designed to challenge the chain of evidence and the manner of discovery. The judge denied most of them and allowed one, which required Corinne to give a supplementary deposition about the specific sequence of how she'd found and accessed the locked cabinet. She gave the supplementary deposition in a side room with the Denver attorneys present and Holloway observing, and she told it the same way she'd told it to Holloway 6 months earlier. The hairpin, the 11 minutes, the 27 minutes of copying, the 4 minutes to relock. She did not minimize it or apologize for it or embellish it. She described it precisely. The Denver attorney who cross-examined her was named Carver, and he was good at his work in the specific way of people who use precision as an offensive tool. Miss Ashcroft, he said, you've described entering a private office without authorization and accessing a locked private cabinet. Is that correct? Yes, she said. And you believe this was justified? I believed it was necessary, she said. Whether it was justified is a question for this proceeding. He looked at her. He had expected a defense of the action, and she'd refused to give him one, which left him without the purchase he needed. The evidence you copied was obtained through an unauthorized entry. You've admitted that. Yes, and the original ledger was found in its original location by authorized officers under Judge Holloway's direction. My copy corroborated the original. You have both, and they match exactly. She looked at him steadily. The question of how I came to know where to look is separate from the question of what was found when authorized personnel looked there. Carver looked at her for a long moment. Nothing further, he said. Ruth Halsey testified on the fourth day. She'd brought her father's letters, 3 of them, in the specific handwriting of a man who'd grown up working a farm and wrote the way such men wrote, careful and unpracticed and entirely his own. She read a section of the 3rd letter aloud at the judge's request, in which her father described his confusion about the terms of his loan with Pike and his sense that something in the numbers didn't make sense, and she read it in the flat, steady voice of a woman who had practiced this enough times that she could get through it, but her hands were not entirely steady on the paper. The courtroom was quiet while she read, not the polite quiet of people waiting for their turn, but the specific quiet of people hearing something that required them to sit with it. Lester Crane's widow, her name was Marion, and she had come from Amarillo with her 2 adult daughters after receiving Holloway's letter, testified on the 6th day. She described her husband's final weeks, which she had spent 4 years being told were the result of illness. She described specific details of those weeks that didn't align with illness, details she'd kept to herself because she hadn't known what to do with them, because there had been nobody to tell them to who would do anything with them. Corinne sat in the courtroom gallery and listened to Marion Crane's testimony and felt the weight of it in a way that was different from the focused, functional energy she'd been running on. This was what the ledger entries actually were, underneath the dates and amounts and transfer timelines. They were this woman. They were Ruth Halsey's letters. They were 14 versions of the same story, told by the people who'd been living inside it, while Dorian Pike kept his careful records in a locked cabinet and built his counterstory and smiled his reasonable smile at circuit judges. She'd known that, abstractly, since she'd first opened the ledger in those 27 minutes. She'd known it in the way you knew something when you were working, when the task was the thing and the human reality of it was held at a slight distance because the task required it. But sitting in that courtroom listening to Marion Crane describe the last 3 weeks of her husband's life, Corinne felt it land in a different place, deeper and more permanent. She was glad she'd fixed the window sash. She was glad she'd stayed. Pike's defense presented for 3 days. It was competent and thorough, and it failed. Not dramatically, but incrementally, piece by piece, in the same way the counterstory had failed in Aldridge's meeting with Galt. Not because any single piece of it was proven false, but because it couldn't account for the pattern. A pattern that existed across 14 cases and 4 years and multiple counties, and 2 physicians and a forged letter and an inactive warrant filed against Owen Mercer's cousin by a man on Pike's payroll was not coincidence, and it was not the natural risk of frontier lending, and it was not a woman with a grudge and an imagination. It was what it was. The ledger said what it said. The numbers didn't lie. The jury deliberated for 1 day and part of a second morning. Corinne was in the courthouse gallery when the verdict came back. She was sitting between Agnes Cole, who had made the trip at her own expense, and Ruth Halsey, who had arrived back for the verdict after going home to her family for the middle days of the trial. She had her hands in her lap and her notebook in her bag and her face arranged in its usual neutral attention, and she watched Pike stand as the foreman read the verdict. Guilty on all counts: fraud, conspiracy, forgery, the unlawful deaths. Every charge confirmed. The room made noise. Not celebration exactly. The wrong register for celebration. Too complicated and too heavy. More like release. The sound of something that had been held under pressure for a long time finally not being held anymore. Pike stood through it. His face did something briefly. Not the performance of calm this time. Something underneath the performance. The thing the performance had been holding back for months. Then it was gone. And he sat down, and the Denver attorneys were already talking to each other in low voices about the next steps they would pursue, which was their job, which they would do, and which would not change the outcome of this room. Boone Haskell, who had testified as a state witness, and in doing so had described his own actions with a flatness that suggested a man who had long since stopped distinguishing between what was right and what he'd been told to do, received a separate sentencing that took into account his cooperation and produced a result that satisfied nobody completely, which was probably the most honest possible outcome. Galt's arrangement settled quietly, without public session. He lost his license. He relocated. Whatever he did afterward was not something Blackridge tracked or cared to. On the last evening before she took the stage back, Corinne walked around the county seat for an hour by herself. It was a bigger town than Blackridge, with a proper hotel and 2 restaurants and a bank that had been there for 30 years, and it had the different quality of a place that had never depended on one man's operation to function. She walked through it and thought about Blackridge, which was smaller and more precarious and had spent 4 years being shaped by something corrupt without fully understanding what was shaping it. She thought about what Agnes had said. Most of us knew something was wrong, and what she'd said back, knowing and being able to act aren't the same thing. She'd been thinking about that exchange for months, returning to it at odd moments, adjusting her understanding of it. There was truth in what she'd said to Agnes. Position and information and timing all mattered, and most people in most situations didn't have the alignment of all three. But there was also something else, something she'd been slower to name. Most people in most situations had more than they thought they did. Not enough to do everything, but enough to do something. Agnes had known, Jonas had known, Mrs. Calloway had known. They hadn't had Corinne's particular combination of factors, but they had had other things, like relationships, knowledge of the town's history, the kind of standing that came from being a longtime resident, and they hadn't used them. Not until someone else started the motion. She didn't think this was cowardice, exactly. It was something more ordinary than cowardice. It was the human tendency to wait for someone else to go first, to assume that the situation was too large or too entrenched or too dangerous for the resources you had, to file the wrong thing in the part of your mind where uncomfortable knowledge went to sit quietly. She had done it herself, in smaller situations, before she'd come to Blackridge. She'd seen things at Hartwell and Sons that she'd noted and not acted on because the cost seemed too high or the result too uncertain. She wasn't standing in judgment of Agnes or Jonas or Mrs. Calloway or even Henderson, whose accommodation had been more serious but was still recognizably human. The accommodation of someone who had made one small choice and then been unable to find the moment when the accumulated small choices could be reversed. What she'd had in Blackridge was different from what she'd had in those situations in St. Louis. She'd had nothing to lose. That was the cold, plain truth of it. No job, no family, no standing in the community, no prior relationship with the powerful man whose operation she was about to dismantle. The things that made most people hesitate, the relationships, the obligations, the fear of losing what you'd built, she'd arrived without any of them. Her vulnerability had been her freedom. She didn't think most people should need to arrive at nothing before they could act on what they knew. But she understood, standing on that street in the county seat in the February cold, why it so often worked out that way. She took the stage back the next morning. Spring came to Blackridge the way it always came to that country. Grudgingly, in pieces, the cold releasing by degrees rather than all at once. The land cases moved through the probate system with the slow deliberation of legal proceedings that were thorough precisely because they'd been preceded by fraud, and each resolution was its own small event. The Forsyth family, Daniel Forsyth's daughter and her husband, who had moved to New Mexico when the property was absorbed into Pike's Holdings, were the first to have their case resolved. They came back in March to see the property for the first time in 3 years and walked through it with the careful, almost disbelieving quality of people who had stopped expecting to receive good news. Corinne had known they were coming and had made sure the main structure was sound, had patched the roof leak that had developed over the winter, had left firewood stacked beside the door. She wasn't there when they arrived. It wasn't her place to be. But she heard from Agnes afterward that the daughter had stood in the yard for a long time just looking, and that her husband had gone very quiet, and that eventually they'd gone inside and not come out for a while. She received a letter from them 3 weeks later. It was short and somewhat formal and thanked her by name and said things that she appreciated and put away in the drawer where she kept the letters that mattered, without rereading them because they didn't need to be reread to be real. The Mercer estate was resolved in April, which was later than the others because Owen's situation was complicated by the fact that the intended marriage had never taken place, and his nearest living relative, a distant cousin in Ohio, had to be located and contacted and asked whether they had any claim or interest. The cousin in Ohio wrote back with the specific tone of someone who had never thought much about the situation and was not particularly invested in it. The letter took 3 weeks to arrive and said, in essence, that he had no claim and no interest and wished the estate well. The probate judge registered Owen Mercer's ranch as an open property with no heir and issued a ruling that it could be sold, with proceeds going to the state or transferred under a homesteading arrangement to an established occupant who could demonstrate caretaking responsibility and intent to maintain. Holloway, who had become somewhat invested in how things resolved in Black Ridge, wrote Corinne a letter informing her of this ruling and noting that she was the established occupant of record with documented caretaking history going back 7 months. She read the letter twice, which she rarely did with things she understood the first time. Then she sat down at Owen's kitchen table and wrote the application. It was not approved instantly. There were forms, and there was a period of review, and there was a visit from a county official who walked the property and noted improvements and asked questions that she answered directly and completely, including the question about her resources, which were limited, and the question about her long-term plans, which were specific and grounded. The approval came in June, on a morning when the yard outside Owen's kitchen window was bright with the particular light that part of the territory produced in early summer, clean and direct, without the softening haze that came later in the season. She stood at the window and held the letter and looked out at the yard and the barn and the fence lines that Owen had maintained so carefully, and she felt something that she didn't have a precise word for, but that was somewhere in the territory between arriving and belonging, the specific condition of a person who has come to a place under difficult circumstances and found, in the difficulty, something they hadn't known they were looking for. She wasn't sentimental about it. She was 31 years old, and she'd been doing her own accounting for long enough to know the difference between the story you told yourself about a thing and the actual nature of the thing. The actual nature of this was, she had a ranch that needed sustained work, in a town that was rebuilding itself in the aftermath of something damaging, with limited resources and no farming background, and a set of skills that were more useful in an office than a barn. Those were real facts. She held them alongside the other real facts, which were that she'd fixed a window sash with a plane she'd found in a tool shed, shimmied a kitchen floor from underneath, learned from Jonas Cole how to evaluate a well casing, spent 6 months maintaining this property through a hard winter, and was still here. She folded the approval letter and put it with the other letters in the drawer. Then she went out to fix the east fence section that had loosened during the spring thaw. Silas had taken the position with the Alderson spread. She'd known he would. He'd mentioned it the week after she'd told him about it, in the same matter-of-fact way he mentioned most things, as information rather than announcement. The Alderson Ranch was 3 miles east of Owen's land, which meant she occasionally saw him in town when both of them had business there. And occasionally he came by if he was riding in that direction, which was not every week, but was often enough that it had become a normal thing rather than a notable one. He was there the afternoon she came in from the east fence, dusty and with a split across the palm of her right hand from the wire that she was holding pressure on with a folded piece of her apron. He looked at the hand when she came through the yard. "Let me see." "It's fine." "Let me see anyway." She showed him. It was a clean cut, not deep enough to be serious. He looked at it with the practical attention of someone who had handled enough fence wire to have done this to himself and knew what it required. "Soap and wrap it," he said. "I know," she said. "You've got wire cutters," he said, looking at the tool belt she'd put together over the winter. "But you're not wearing the heavy gloves. They restrict the grip. They also restrict the cuts." She looked at him. He looked at her. This was the nature of most of their exchanges, practical, direct, occasionally edged with the specific friction of two people who were both accustomed to solving problems their own way and found each other's methods alternately useful and irritating. "I'll wear the gloves," she said. "I'm not telling you what to do." "You were definitely implying it." "I was noting a causal relationship between the absence of gloves and the presence of blood." She almost smiled. "Come inside. The coffee's still on." He came inside. She washed the cut and wrapped it and poured 2 cups, and they sat at Owen's table the way they'd sat at it several times over the past several months, in a silence that had gradually become the comfortable kind rather than the wary kind, the kind that didn't need to be filled. "Ruth Halsey's planting her father's fields this spring," he said. "I heard. She's doing it herself, her and her oldest son." "I know. I'm lending them the seed sour next week." He looked at his coffee. "You've got a lot going on for someone who arrived 3 weeks before she intended to leave." I stayed, she said simply. You stayed, he agreed. He was quiet for a moment. You ever think about going back to St. Louis? She thought about it honestly. Sometimes. When the winters are hard and the work is hard, and I'm in the middle of something I don't know how to do yet. She looked at the window. Then I figure out how to do it, and the thought goes away. He nodded slowly. What about you? She asked. Ever think about leaving? He turned his coffee cup in his hands. The same gesture he'd had from the beginning, the closest thing to visible restlessness that he showed. Less than I used to, he said. She understood that. She didn't push it further. They sat in the kitchen of a ranch that had been built by a man neither of them had known well enough, in a town that was learning what it meant to look at itself honestly, in a territory that had more than its share of people who'd come from somewhere else and found, in the difficulty of being there, the thing they'd needed without knowing they were looking for it. There was nothing extraordinary about any of this from the outside. It was a woman with a split palm and a fence section to finish, a man with dirt on his boots and a job 3 miles east, 2 cups of coffee on an oak table that had been in this kitchen longer than either of them had been alive. But Corinne had spent enough time with numbers to know that the things that looked simple from the outside were often the things that had cost the most to arrive at, and that the cost was not something to minimize or perform modesty about. It was something to acknowledge, quietly, to yourself, in the way you acknowledged anything true. Clearly, without embellishment, without pretending it was less than it was. She had come to Black Ridge with $42 and nowhere she had to be. And she had spent 27 minutes with a hairpin in a locked room, and 14 families were rebuilding what had been taken from them. And a man who had spent 6 years carrying a warrant someone else had filed against him was 3 miles east learning what it felt like to be clean. She had not done that alone. She'd been helped by a 17-year-old boy who ran errands, and an old woman who pressed $6 into her hand, and a retired physician who was old and angry and wanted to say his piece, and a grieving daughter with her father's letters, and a crowd of women who decided that enough was enough, and came walking down the main street of Black Ridge on a Friday night with a purpose. She had not saved this town. The town had done the harder part itself, the part that required people to stop waiting for someone else to go first, to stop filing what they knew in the quiet corner of themselves and start saying it out loud. What she'd done was go first, and she'd been able to do that because she'd arrived with nothing to protect, which was a strange and specific kind of freedom that she would not recommend as a life strategy, but that she understood now was what the situation had required. The east fence wouldn't finish itself. She'd get back to it tomorrow with the heavier gloves. She picked up her coffee cup. Outside the kitchen window, the June light lay across Owen Mercer's land in long, even lines, and the barn door was open the way she always left it in the afternoons. And somewhere on the east edge of the property, a meadowlark was making an elaborate argument about something that only meadowlarks fully understood. She listened to it for a moment. Then she drank her coffee, and Silas drank his, and the afternoon went on being what it was, ordinary and hard-won and entirely, specifically real.